Fringe Recon, Trebium Wars, Book 3, by Matt Edsand. Narrated by Matt Edsand. Chapter 1, Trebium Mine Outside of Tomb. Lieutenant Cruz stared at Marine Captain Faulkner. He had been standing at the edge of the force field looking out towards the sky for the last 10 minutes. She didn't understand what he was doing. Standing there at the edge wasn't going to change anything. The Rukpli force field was still there. It had been 3 hours since the Rukpli force field had trapped her and Riley with Faulkner. This was the last place she had expected to be trapped. The Rukpli aliens never had the intention of blowing up the Trebium mine. Their goal had been simple: to block all mining operations, and to some extent they had succeeded. Marine Captain Peters had informed her to stay calm while he spoke to General Williams. However, looking at the force field and the current situation, Cruz didn't expect any good news for a while. They couldn't blow up the force field. She had already considered her approach and its implication. If they tried that approach, the mine entrance could cave in on itself, killing them and permanently stopping all mining operations. In the early days when the Trebium mine had been discovered, she recalled that it had only been one mine. A team had been sent to this region to try and discover whether there were other nearby mines enriched with Trebium, but it had failed. For whatever reason, there was only one mine which had an abundant supply of the mineral. However, there could be other sources of Trebium in other parts of Euphra, yet no one had considered searching Euphra. Cruz was tempted to shout out at Faulkner to get back from the force field. She didn't want him injuring himself by being so close to the force field. The last thing she wanted to have on her hands was to tend to an injured Faulkner. Then again, she realized that Faulkner was a Marine captain. She had no sense about Faulkner, except that Peters didn't seem to like him. Peters must have had a good reason for disliking Faulkner. Although she sensed it strongly from Peters, he never spoke of it. Finally, Faulkner turned and walked back towards her position. How long will it take for them to bring down the force field? Cruz didn't like the question. She understood it was a valid one to ask, but the question brought with it a lot of fear and hopelessness. He seemed to be waiting for the force field to come down. Eventually, the force field would come down one way or another, but Cruz didn't want to let her thoughts linger on the possibilities too long. "We just need to wait it out," Cruz replied. "But Peters and the rest will get it down, right?" Faulkner asked. "Captain, no one knows," Cruz said. "We are dealing with alien technology." That was the hard truth. Humanity was dealing with a force field generated based on an alien technology. Would the engineers be able to find a way through the force field? She couldn't tell. Peters hadn't replied to her either when she had asked him the question. Cruz had to admit it was an unknown. Fortunately, she and Riley had run in with their backpacks, which had enough food and water for a while. And she realized she would have to share it with Faulkner in time to come. But not yet. Outside, the stars had begun to invade the sky. Nightfall was coming. Cruz hoped Peters and UFS Central Command were working on a way to get them out of here. Then a slow rumbling emerged from the depths of the mine. Cruz spun around, lifting her weapon. What was that? Faulkner didn't flinch. It should be the end of the shift. Cruz's eyes widened. "Do you mean there were people still drilling down there while the Rukpli were attacking the mine?" Faulkner avoided eye contact with her. "We didn't have time to inform them. We don't have a system of communication in place with the people doing the drilling." Cruz couldn't believe it. How could they have no system of communication in place? What if something happened to someone down in the mine? She clenched her fist. In a little while, there would be many more people arriving at the mine entrance, and each of them would discover they are trapped. Chapter 2, Trebium Mine Outside of Tomb. Peters sat in Faulkner's makeshift office. The space was really a mess, which more than justified that Faulkner had no discipline. There were papers and rubbish scattered all over the place. He wasn't surprised by the mess, but couldn't understand how someone could operate within it. At first glance, Faulkner hadn't appeared to be the meticulous type, and the mess around his feet justified that assessment. Peters was even surprised Faulkner had been able to make it to the rank of Marine Captain. There was a buzz on the console and General Williams' image appeared. "General," Peters acknowledged. He hadn't expected a call so soon from the general, but Peters knew the situation at the Trebium mine was serious. "Have you been able to find a way to deactivate the force field?" Williams asked. Peters could sense the frustration in his tone. General Williams was extremely unhappy that the Rukpli aliens had been able to stop the Trebium mineral project. It would seriously impact any further development of both the armor and the destroyers, which were the only things protecting them from the Rukpli aliens. "Our engineers on site are still working on it," Peters replied. He had gotten down a group of engineers from Titanic Base and given them the order to find a way to break through the Rukpli force field. The engineers had accepted their task without much concern. "Tell them to move faster," Williams insisted. "We cannot afford to have any stoppage of the building of the destroyers due to the lack of Trebium." How much Trebium is there left? Peters asked. He understood whatever was mined here was then taken to processing plants at Tomb, after which they were sent over to the Euphra shipyards. There's sufficient for now, Williams replied, but it won't last. How long can the people trapped inside survive based on their current supplies? Peters wasn't sure if Williams was really concerned about the welfare of the people trapped inside. It was more likely that the general didn't want to be perceived as being unable to break through an alien force field. Peters had to admit that it would tarnish the reputation of the Euphra Defense Forces and make the civilian population question their capabilities. However, the reality was that his engineers were dealing with an alien technology which required time. My people should be able to last in there for a few days, Peters said. He had done a check on the rations in his backpack. It would easily provide them sufficient water and food for a few days. But beyond that, things would start to become difficult for Cruz, Faulkner, and his man Riley, trapped inside the Trebium mine. Find a way to get them out soon, Williams demanded. The media haven't picked up on this attack as of yet. The attacks on Arcadia have kept them busy, but that could change at any moment. Then we would have a lot of people descending down on the Trebium mine. That is something I do not want happening. Get your guys to secure the area and keep away any curious people. Affirmative, Peters nodded. What about the captured Rukpli alien? Peters had managed to secure it and get his men to move it into a combat shuttle and send it over to Titanic base. The container arrived a little while ago, Williams declared. I've asked Colonel Ramirez to keep it in a secure facility with round-the-clock guards. I'll get Ramirez to try and start an interrogation soon, but our priority is getting rid of the force field. Peters nodded and the comms link went dead. Then he heard shouting from outside the makeshift office. Chapter 3. Laboratories. Euphra shipyards. Humphreys continued to run different tests on the Rukpli cells using the emitters, which produced an ultrasonic sound. He had been unable to get multiple emitters into this makeshift space, which had become his new laboratory. The UFS personnel had informed him that this location inside one of the domes was secure as it was lined with Trebium. Humphreys had accepted it with a tinge of hope. After witnessing one of the Rukpli aliens up close, he doubted anything could hold those aliens back, but he didn't like this space. It could never replicate his lab back at Science Division 1. It was more cramped and lacked the space for him to stroll about. Despite that, he simply had to do with what he was given. He had also received reports that indicated a single emitter wasn't able to control more than one Rukpli alien. That itself was a major limitation to the emitter. If true, it would be a stumbling block to defeating the alien species. He needed to find better ways to make the emitter signal stronger, or a different means to weaken the Rukpli aliens. How can I help you? Ryan asked. Officer Ryan had been assigned to him as an assistant. Humphreys had been wary of getting an assistant, especially when he was someone who had no background in science. He realized that kind of assistant would end up getting in his way more than helping him. However, Humphreys hadn't been able to find a way to get rid of him. Ryan had also indicated that he was here to protect him, which made it harder to keep the officer away from his delicate work. Can you shift that emitter to the next table? Humphreys asked. Ryan walked over, grabbed the emitter and placed it on the other table. Humphreys cringed as he observed the young officer in action. The careless manner in which Ryan handled the emitter was sufficient proof that the young officer wasn't suitable to be with him in this space. But Humphreys decided to keep his mouth shut. He wasn't going to get the young man to touch his samples with the Rukpli cells. Humphreys walked over to the other table and was about to turn on the emitter when he heard a sound. What's that? Ryan looked flustered. Sorry, sir, I left my device on the table with the emitter. I think it's causing the sound. Let me... Humphreys interrupted the junior officer. Don't move. Ryan froze and looked up at him in confusion. Humphreys looked at the Rukpli cells. He thought he had caught a glimpse of a reaction, but the Rukpli cells were nowhere near the human cells. He examined the sample. There it was again, another reaction. It was very fast. What should I do? Ryan asked as he shuffled his feet. Humphreys realized that the young officer had been standing in the same position waiting for his next instruction. Slowly go to your device and check what it's indicating, Humphreys ordered. Walk very gently and carefully. Ryan slowly walked over to his device and looked at him. It seems to be detecting a faint signal, but I think there must be something wrong with my device. There should be no signal inside this location. Humphreys ignored Ryan's conclusion about the device. Bring the device closer to where I am. Ryan carried his device over and set it down next to the sample. Humphreys was relieved that the young officer was more careful this time. What's the device indicating now? Humphreys asked. Ryan scratched his head. I don't believe it. The signals become stronger, but I don't understand. What could be causing a signal inside this room? It's just the two of us. It isn't just the two of us, Humphreys admitted. Ryan looked even more confused as he glanced around. What do you mean? I mean we aren't alone. We have Rukpli cells in this room with us. Ryan frowned. It was obvious the junior officer didn't understand the implications. I believe the Rukpli cells are communicating to each other, Humphreys announced. Chapter 4. Trebium Mine outside of Tomb. Peters raced out of the office and towards the entrance of the Trebium mine. He was astonished to find a group of humans standing beside Lieutenant Cruz and Captain Faulkner. Where had they come from? The shouting had been from his own men and women who were stationed outside the mine entrance. They must have gotten excited when the group of humans emerged from deep inside the mine. When his men and women observed him coming, they stopped their chattering. "What's going on here?" Peters demanded. One of his men stepped forward. "Captain, out of nowhere, we observed there were many more people inside the force field." "I can see that," Peters said. "Did anyone ask Lieutenant Cruz what's going on?" None of the men and women had an answer for him. Peters tried his best to control himself. Not a single one of them had taken the initiative to find out the reasons for the new people inside the Trebium mine. Instead, they had chosen to talk amongst themselves. "Everyone, back to your stations," Peters ordered. The group of men and women dispersed quickly without another word. Then Peters walked up to the edge of the force field, pulled out his device and wrote something on it and turned it towards Cruz, who by now was looking in his direction. "What are all these people doing inside the mine?" Cruz wrote on her device and showed it to Peters. "These people are those who just finished their night shift in the mine. They were still mining when the attack was ongoing. No one told them to evacuate the mine." Peters grimaced. Cruz must have noticed the tension on his face, but she was wise to keep her mouth shut. On the other hand, Faulkner was avoiding all eye contact with him. Peters didn't have to ask who had forgotten to inform the people down in the mine. This was Faulkner's mess, and now he would have to also clean it up. Peters hadn't anticipated that there would be a group of human miners still inside the Trebium mine. That complicated everything. Cruz would now need to manage the civilians inside the mine. It wasn't going to be an easy task, and she couldn't rely on Faulkner. He wrote on his device, "Try to keep the people under control until we find a way through the force field." Cruz nodded and then turned back to face the people. Peters didn't want to discuss the issue of rations with Cruz at the moment. The urgency to find a way through the Rukpli force field had just increased by tenfold. He realized all of those people wouldn't be able to survive for more than a day or two. He turned and walked towards the location where the engineers were huddled together. He hoped they would have some answers for him. One of the engineers stood up. "Captain, how long before we can get through the force field?" Peters asked. "We need several more hours to find a way," the engineer replied. Chapter 5, Captain's Ready Room, UFS Intrepid. Stanley opened the holoscreen. Admiral Sheldon's face appeared. Stanley had been waiting to hear from Sheldon regarding his proposal, as he had estimated that the meeting with the Euphra Council had ended a few hours ago. Sheldon had called for an emergency session of the Euphra Council to deliberate on the proposed mission to the fringe of the Vonia system. "Admiral, how was the meeting with the Euphra Council?" Stanley asked. "Stanley, the Council had its concerns," Sheldon began. Stanley tried his best not to reveal his unhappiness with the Euphra Council. He had expected it wouldn't be easy to convince the Council. Prior to the meeting, Sheldon had also reminded him that if the Council didn't approve of the proposed mission, it would need to be scrapped. But he had hoped the recent attacks on Arcadia itself would have compelled the Euphra Council to take a more proactive approach. Sitting back and waiting to be attacked by the Rukpli aliens wasn't an option. They needed to strike at the Rukpli aliens. The origin of the secret transmission provided their first chance to do just that. Sheldon continued, "Their primary concern was diverting so many resources to such a mission. And what I mean by resources are our new destroyers." "But, sir," Stanley commented. Sheldon raised his hand. "Let me finish. General Williams and I were able to convince the Euphra Council that the mission was of utmost importance. After further deliberation, the Euphra Council approved for you to only take the UFS Intrepid and one other vessel to investigate the origin of the transmission. We managed to get them to release the UFS Winston to join you on this mission. That's the best we could get from the Council. We accepted their decision. You will have command over both vessels." Stanley nodded. He was relieved that the Euphra Council had at least approved the mission with limited resources. Although only 2 vessels could be deployed for the mission, it was better than nothing. He had wanted a few more vessels, knowing the serious threat the Rukpli posed and the unknown dangers into which they were heading. He would just have to make do with what was given. "In hindsight, I think it's sufficient for your mission," Sheldon said. "We just commissioned 3 more new destroyers, and they'll be heading out to orbit a few days before you leave for the mission. Those 3 additional vessels should be able to cover Euphra while you're away." "Acknowledged, sir," Stanley said. "We'll start making preparations to get underway in a few days." He was glad that the commissioning of the new vessels had begun. He had heard that many of those in the shipyards were working tirelessly to get as many of the new destroyers ready for combat as fast as possible. To get 3 more destroyers out was a great step forward for the UFS. It would help expand the orbital defenses around Euphra. Stanley recalled that none of this would have been possible without Admiral Harris. He never even got the chance to attend the Admiral's funeral. "There's one more thing I need to let you know, Sheldon. admitted. General Williams is unable to allocate to you any Marine units for your 2 vessels. The recent attack on Arcadia and the Trebium mine have required a lot of Euphra defense forces to be reassigned across the cities. They are also stretched thin at the moment. I understand, Stanley remarked. We'll try to manage it ourselves and not expose our crew to any unnecessary dangers. Sheldon acknowledged, and the holoscreen went blank. Chapter 6. Trebium Mine outside of Tomb. Lieutenant Cruz stood her ground against a group of 10 people who had emerged at the end of the night shift. She hadn't expected so many to have been working in the mine while the Rukpli aliens were on the outside attacking the soldiers. It was surprising that none of them had heard of all the ruckus happening at the entrance to the mine. Everyone, we need you to remain calm, Cruz announced. The Euphra defense forces are working on disabling the force field. We need to give them time. An older man raised his fist. That's what you always say. But what I want to know is this. How come we weren't informed to evacuate during the attack by the aliens? Cruz's eyes shifted in the direction of Faulkner. He was looking at the ground. She couldn't believe his stance on the matter. He didn't even have the courage to own up and admit his mistake. The attack was unexpected and took us all by surprise, Cruz said. There was no time to inform you. She had no choice but to cover Faulkner's mistake. If these men discovered that Faulkner had forgotten to evacuate them, things could escalate quickly. The older man raised his voice. I disagree. I thought there were additional Marine units deployed outside of the entrance to the mine. Shouldn't they have been alerted to any such attack? If not, what's the point of those additional Marine units? A few of the other men in the group were nodding in agreement with the older man. The frustration on their faces was evident. Cruz realized this older man was going to be a problem. If he became their de facto leader, it could complicate everything. She motioned for him to come closer. The older man approached her. What's your name? Cruz asked. Gerald, the older man replied as he folded his arms. Look, Gerald, there are engineers outside trying to bring the force field down, Cruz said. But we need to give them time to do it. They're dealing with an alien technology. It's the only way any of us are getting out of here. I understand we are all worried about what's going on here. This is all I can say for now, as I also do not know any more. Gerald frowned. I still don't understand why no one told us about it. We could have made a run for it. The 2 aliens were standing at the entrance firing at everyone. Cruz highlighted. Most of 1 unit of Marines is already dead. If you had run out, you and the rest of the group would also have been killed. Although it was a mistake not to inform you, that fact alone probably saved you all. The weight of her words began to sink into Gerald's mind. A flicker of fear crossed his eyes. Cruz hoped she was getting through to him. Are you the head of this group? Cruz asked. She needed to know what his position was and whether he was going to be a problem for Faulkner and her or not. Gerald shook his head. We don't have a leader among us. I was just voicing what all of them are probably thinking silently. Many of them are scared, but afraid to say it out loud. We all took this job because it pays well, and it helps our families back in Tomb. Cruz nodded. I understand. I need your help to keep the rest of the men calm while my people outside try to sort everything out. Do you have enough food and supplies for the night? Most of us should be fine for the night, Gerald said as he glanced back at the group of men. Although I don't know how long I can keep them calm. Everyone's worried because we heard of the attacks on Arcadia. Now, hearing of the attack here at the mine, many will be worried about their families. When we don't return, our families will begin to panic. Will someone be able to inform our families? Cruz nodded. Yes, I'll get my captain to inform the families. With that, Gerald turned around and returned to the group of men. Cruz let out a sigh of relief. Then the men formed a circle around Gerald. Cruz expected he was explaining to them the situation. Whether Gerald wanted it or not, he had become their de facto leader. She was glad that Gerald hadn't turned out to be the problem he could have been. Despite that, she would need to keep an eye on him. These men had come to the Trebium mine to work for the money. Their work was helping build the destroyers to defend against the Rukpli aliens. It wasn't easy working so deep in the Trebium mines. There were many dangers. It was common knowledge that not many people wanted to work down there. But these men had chosen to do it. Cruz felt for them. These men sacrificed for the greater good. Cruz realized she had to find a way to help these men. She then turned to Faulkner and glared at him. This shouldn't have happened. Not on your watch. Faulkner remained silent. Cruz scowled at him and walked away. Chapter 7. Inside the Dome, Euphra Shipyards. Lieutenant Storen looked over the list of items that were being loaded onto the shuttle. Although there was an ample number of supplies for the 2 destroyers, another batch of Trebium armor and weapons took up the most amount of space in the cargo bay. This was the 4th shuttle that was being prepared to launch for the destroyers. Admiral Sheldon had sent him the orders a few hours ago. Storen had been surprised that the UFS Intrepid and the UFS Winston were being deployed on a mission. Upon receiving the orders, he had to hustle his men and women to start on the preparations. Fortunately, they had a large supply of Trebium armor that had been accumulating over the last few weeks. Most of the other Trebium armor had been sent to the Euphra Defense Forces and the Euphra Security Services over the last few months. However, Storen had heard of the Rukpli attack on the Trebium mine. He realized eventually that the attack would slow down the process of building the destroyers. The slowdown might not happen immediately, but over time, it would impact their productivity. He had already heard of murmurs against his personnel in the shipyards. The comms bust. It was Captain Stanley. Storen, what's the ETA on the items you requested? Stanley asked. He didn't like Stanley's tone and taking orders from him. Admiral Sheldon had sent him the orders only yesterday. The men and women under him weren't robots. They needed time to get everything in order. Although they had robot conveyors to move the Trebium armor, the checking of everything still needed human effort. There was simply no way around it. We should be able to send it out in a few hours, Storen replied. That's great, Stanley said. I'll also be sending some extra packs of Trebium, Storen highlighted, in case you need them on your mission. I guess there's no harm in packing more, Stanley commented. Do send us a transmission once the shuttles are on their way. Affirmative, Storen said and ended the comms. Who did Stanley think he was? He was only a captain of a vessel. Storen hated the way Stanley was ordering him around. He felt his heart begin to shudder. Storen put his hand on his heart. It was pounding. That was unusual for him. He didn't understand it. One of the men walked up to him. Sir, we have nearly finished placing the cargo into most of the shuttles. We'll be ready for launch in an hour. Storen nodded. What about the extra packages I sent over? They're also inside, the man replied. When ready, ask the pilots to head over to the vessels in orbit, Storen ordered. Affirmative, sir, the man said and left him. Storen didn't want to be reminded by Stanley or Admiral Sheldon about it any further. At least it was done, and his special packages were soon going to be on their way too. The Rukpli seed inside Lieutenant Storen smiled to itself. It had received instructions from the Supreme Leader an hour ago. Everything was going as planned. The human species would pay for their trespassing on this planet. Chapter 8. Trebium Mine outside of Thum. Gerald approached Cruz. She didn't know what he wanted with her now. She hoped that the group of miners weren't about to cause a new problem. Lieutenant Cruz, may I have a word with you? Gerald asked. Cruz gestured to him to one side of the mine entrance. She didn't want Faulkner overhearing whatever Gerald had to say. Faulkner had remained passive ever since the appearance of the group of miners, and Cruz preferred it that way. She didn't want him making things worse for everyone. He had already done enough to put them all in this complicated situation. One of the guys said that he saw something down there while operating the robot drillers, Gerald started. Saw as in what? Cruz asked. He thinks it's related to the alien species, Gerald admitted, glancing around so as not to let his words be heard by the rest. Was he able to describe what he saw? Cruz asked. Gerald shrugged. Deep down in the mine, it's really hard to say what we see or not see. With all the noise from the robot drillers and the dust, it can be quite challenging. Sometimes I also think I see things, but in the end, it's only my imagination. But if he brought it to you, I guess he must have seen something, Cruz said. How certain is he of what he saw? Cruz was skeptical. How was it possible that no one before this had observed anything linked to the alien species inside the depths of the Trebium mine? There were multiple shifts of humans who took turns mining the Trebium. However, Cruz had to admit the arrival of the aliens had only occurred 3 months ago. Prior to that, not a single human being on Euphra would have been on the lookout for such things. Even if any of the miners had noticed something, they would have ignored it as just shadows or junk inside the mine. To me, he seems quite sure what he saw down there, Gerald commented. Then we need to take a look at it, Cruz said. Outside the entrance to the Trebium mine, it was dark. She glanced around the cave. Most of the miners were asleep on the ground. A few were snoring away. They had all consumed some of the extra food they had brought with them when going into the mine for their shift. Cruz had been relieved that there had been sufficient water and food for them. Meanwhile, Faulkner was seated at one side of the cave. She didn't know why he wasn't asleep. She hoped he would stay like that, but she still needed to let him know where she was going. The other man in the unit, Riley, was leaning against the wall. When do you want to take a look? Gerald asked. Now, Cruz replied. Gerald was a bit taken back, but nodded reluctantly. There was no time like now to do this. Cruz didn't want to wait until first light. She also had no way to check with Captain Peters on it. But if this mine had some other things related to the Rukpli alien species, she needed to find out immediately. It might help them understand better why the Rukpli were after the Trebium. It might even give them a way out of the force field. She had to take the chance and explore the possibility. Get your man ready in 2 minutes, Cruz directed. I'm going to inform Captain Faulkner over there, and then we'll head down into the mine. Okay, Gerald agreed and walked over to the group of men sleeping on the ground. Cruz sighed before heading towards Faulkner. She was going to have to rely on him to keep everything in order while she was away. She would also tell Riley to keep an eye on Faulkner. Chapter 9. Titanic Base, Arcadia. Colonel Ramirez walked down the corridor to the secure bunker. General Williams had called him back to Arcadia so that he could take the lead in the interrogation of the Rukpli prisoner. Ramirez had been surprised that he had been activated for the task. He had expected Williams to assign it to Captain Peters. Williams seemed to have a natural affinity to Peters, which Ramirez found to be unfair. He didn't know if it was because he was still unhappy about General Myers choosing Williams instead of himself to take over Euphra Defense Forces, but Ramirez had obeyed the command. The Rukpli alien prisoner had arrived at Titanic Base an hour ago. Ramirez had never seen such an alien face to face. The only images he had seen was from a report that Williams had shared with him. In a few minutes, that was about to change. Once he reached the door at the end of the corridor, he placed his face on yet another retinal scanner. Although Ramirez understood the need for the multiple levels of security clearance, he hoped this would be the last scanner he had to pass through. It took only a few seconds before a beep authenticated his identity. The door opened and he slipped inside. In the center of the secure room was a closed, square-shaped chamber. On all four sides of the chamber were heavily armed guards wearing Trebium full-body armor. The nearest armed guard to the door also had an emitter beside his feet. There were recording devices at multiple points on the ceiling of the room. The moment he stepped inside, the four men stood a bit straighter and saluted Ramirez as he stepped in. Ramirez returned the salute and gestured for the armed guard nearest to the door. The armed guard approached him. Colonel, the alien is secured inside the chamber. The chamber is lined with Trebium as well. Is the Rukpli inside the container? Ramirez asked. The armed guard nodded. We haven't yet opened the container. We were waiting for your arrival before we did it. How will I be able to speak to it? Ramirez asked. Since the chamber was closed on every side, it seemed like he wouldn't have a chance to actually see the alien face to face. Ramirez had been hopeful to get a look at a live Rukpli alien. It was his first encounter with a species outside of Earth. The armed guard escorted him to the right side. On that side, there was a small hole drilled into the casing of the chamber. You can speak through this, the armed man pointed to the hole. The alien will be able to clearly hear you. This hole has been designed to carry your voice without any interference. I guess I won't be able to see the Rukpli when I'm talking to it, right? Ramirez inquired. We have inserted a miniature recording device into the chamber, the armed man remarked. The Rukpli will be unaware of it. I will pass you a device to watch the alien's reaction as you speak to it. It may not be the best at seeing it face to face, but it'll give you a live video feed of what's going on inside the chamber. Excellent, Ramirez said. Whenever you're ready, let's begin. He grabbed a chair from one corner of the room and brought it closer to the hole through which he would need to speak to the Rukpli alien. On the way down to the secure bunker, he had mulled over his approach with interrogating the alien. He wasn't experienced in such interrogations. In fact, he doubted anyone on Euphra would be equipped to run an interrogation, especially of an enemy combatant. He recalled that interrogations had been common back on Earth during the years of the war, but in Euphra, interrogations and the practice of conducting them had been lost over the years. He'd need to discuss with General Williams on reinstituting them for those in command. The armed man walked over to the left wall. Colonel, I'll be activating the opening of the container. Once that happens, we'll observe its actions. If the alien goes out of control inside the chamber, we'll initiate the emitter. Ramirez nodded. Only start the emitter on my signal. Another armed man passed him a device. On the screen was a live video feed of the container inside the sealed chamber. Each of the men looked calm, but Ramirez doubted that was really the case. Just like him, he suspected their hearts would be pounding. The Rukpli aliens had killed so many innocents and soldiers. The aliens' attack on Arcadia and the Trebium mine would be recorded down in this planet's history as the greatest loss of life by an enemy on Euphra. He clenched his hands. However, Ramirez realized he couldn't let his emotions get the better of him. This was an important interrogation. He wouldn't let anything cloud his judgment. He needed to think clearly to get whatever information he could from the Rukpli alien prisoner. I pressed it, the armed man announced. The first ever interrogation of an alien species by a human was about to begin. Chapter 10, Trebium Mine outside of Tomb. Cruz hadn't been surprised by Faulkner's lack of reaction to her going deeper into the mine to investigate something one of the miners Roy had observed. She couldn't understand what was wrong with him. She also didn't have the time to care about it. Faulkner had agreed to keep an eye on the group of miners while she was away. That was all that mattered to her. It had been a few minutes since she, Gerald, and Roy had begun their journey deeper into the mine. Roy had kept to himself and one step behind Gerald. As they strode into the mine, the first signs of the presence of the robot drillers appeared. Tracks left by the robot drillers could be seen all across the ground. Cruz didn't like the silence. How many robot drillers are there? Each of the men operate one of the robot drillers, Gerald replied. They are quite big in size and it isn't an easy job to operate. All of us had to undergo significant training on operating the machinery. Were any of you part of the original people who used the robot drillers during the days when Euphra was initially colonized? Cruz asked. She had heard of the remarkable achievements of the robot drillers when Euphra was initially colonized. My father was one of them, Roy said. I grew up watching him talk about the robot drillers. He was very proud to have been able to help build the initial cities on Euphra. I guess I took up his job when he passed away. Many of us come from families who were involved with the robot drillers in one way or another, Gerald added. Cruz turned to Roy. So, what did you exactly see? It was a shiny thing that I noticed a day ago in the area my robot driller was excavating, Roy admitted. I didn't think much about it until we came out and realized we were trapped in an alien force field. We'll reach that area I was talking about in a little while. After a few more minutes of walking, they came to a junction with several passageways in front of them. Cruz counted at least 10 of them. Gerald must have noticed her confusion. These passageways weren't created by us. I was told they were discovered in the early days of mining the Trebium. Cruz was taken back by that revelation. She had never heard of such passageways before. I heard that the miners in those days did inform their superiors, Gerald said, but I don't know what happened with that information. Cruz frowned. Somewhere along the way there had been a breakdown in communication. These passageways aren't natural, right? Cruz asked. No, they aren't, Gerald remarked. Notice how smooth the sides of the entrance to each of the passageways are. These were definitely carved out by something or someone. Was this why the Rukpli were after the Trebium? Had they built this mine? If so, it meant the Rukpli, as they had stated, had been on this planet a long time ago. How do you know which passageway to mine in? Cruz asked. Before we were sent out here, we were told which passageways to do the mining in, Gerald commented. I heard some of the passageways have caved in and some are dead ends. We only use a couple of them, but I don't know who made those initial decisions on the selection of the passageways. This way, Roy gestured, and she and Gerald followed him into one of the passageways. As Cruz stepped into the passageway, it was becoming much clearer that these were created by a machine. But if so, it still didn't explain why the Rukpli aliens hadn't surfaced 50 years ago. Another few minutes of trudging and Roy stopped in front of a machine. Cruz had never before seen a driller up close. It wasn't a big machine. She had expected it to be a large one. Roy smiled. Your expression is the same whenever a person first encounters a robot driller. It's a pretty small machine, but don't be fooled by it. The machine is very powerful. Its engines are as powerful as that of a shuttle. Where's the thing you found? Cruz asked. She checked her device. There was only an hour or two before first light. They needed to complete this investigation as soon as possible. Roy pointed to the right of the robot driller, over here. He then stepped forward and touched the wall. Cruz approached the wall, pulled out her device and pointed it at the section of the passageway wall. A faint energy reading appeared on her device. Step back, Cruz warned the two men as she pointed her weapon at the wall. Chapter 11. Bridge, UFS Intrepid. Commander, have you got all the supplies we need? Stanley asked as he glanced at his console. The last shuttles just departed our hangar bay after delivering the supplies and armor, his XO replied. I'm checking with the UFS Winston on their status. Stanley nodded. He wanted to get underway as soon as possible. The 3 new UFS destroyers had arrived in orbit an hour ago. He had briefly checked in with the 3 new captains and welcomed them. He had been glad that Euphra would have more than sufficient protection while he was away. Although those new UFS destroyers had newly promoted captains, the Trebium hull would help them fend off any attack by the Rukpli fleet. Stanley realized he was making the presumption that the Rukpli would return to Euphra with a fleet. However, no one knew what to expect from the Rukpli. The initial 2 rounds of attack had been done by a few Rukpli with a few vessels. There had been no evidence to suggest that the Rukpli even had a fleet, but the Rukpli attacks had been precise and effective. So far, they knew the Rukpli had a strong and deadly military arm, but that was the extent of the information. He hoped this mission to the fringe of the Vonia system would help them uncover more about the Rukpli aliens. It was imperative to find out what they were up against. He opened the private comms to Captain Ronald of the UFS Winston. Captain, are you ready on your side? Yes, sir, Ronald replied. The last shuttle left our hangar bay a few minutes ago. My XO will send you the signal and then we can break orbit and put in a route to the source of the transmission, Stanley directed. Affirmative, Ronald said, and the comms ended. Stanley didn't know how Captain Ronald was going to manage this mission. He hadn't had the time to check if he had an experienced XO and other staff to help him. He turned to his XO. Do you know the XO on the UFS Winston? Mendes shook his head. All I know is that he's a junior crew member. I don't think they were able to find any experienced XO for Captain Ronald. Stanley bit his lip. That was going to be a major challenge going forward. What about the rest of his crew? Stanley asked. I heard his navigation and tactical officers are seasoned ones with the UFS Winston being their second posting, Mendes replied. I don't know much about the rest of his crew. I do have a friend on board the UFS Winston. I'll ask around discreetly. At least some of the bridge crew on the UFS Winston had experience. That was as much as Stanley could hope for. The unknown danger they were traveling into was going to test not only the new destroyers but also the crew. Prepare to break orbit, Stanley said. Aye, Captain, the navigation officer replied. Chapter 12, Armstrong Station, Euphra orbit. Commander, I need to show you something, Lieutenant Sherry said. Diaz turned her seat in the direction of Sherry. Diaz didn't even feel the weight of the new Trebium armor that had been shipped to Armstrong Station. It was the only protection everyone on the space station had against any future attack. As Diaz stood, she realized that she still found it uncomfortable when people called her by the new rank of commander. 3 months ago, when the Rukpli aliens initially attacked Euphra, she had been only a lieutenant who had just been assigned to Armstrong Station. Could she have ever conceived she would be promoted to commander in a mere 3 months? Never did she even contemplate such a progression in her career. However, after the attack by the Rukpli, Admiral Sheldon and UFS Central Command had made the necessary changes. Many people who didn't have the experience had to be promoted. It was out of necessity. Everyone knew the Rukpli aliens would be back. The only thing which remained was when that would happen. 2 other junior lieutenants had also been promoted to the rank of commander. But she had the added responsibility of being in charge of the entire space station. The last 3 months had been one of learning and unlearning. With many people dead, the gaps in the knowledge of how to maintain a space station had fallen on her and the rest. Fortunately, there still had been a small group of people who ran the operations of key departments that Diaz could rely on, and she did rely on them heavily. Diaz had chosen to be transparent with everyone the day she took over as commander of the space station. She had got everyone into the largest meeting room on the station and been honest with them. She had told them while she had no experience of leadership, she needed their help to get the station ready for the Rukpli aliens. Diaz had been fearful as she spoke on that day, but in the subsequent days, the people on the space station had come together to find out what they didn't know and learn from each other. Diaz had been hopeful an admiral would be assigned to the space station, but Sheldon had shot that idea down quickly, saying there were no suitable people for that position. Diaz walked over to Sherry's workstation. What is it? 3 days ago, I observed a strange signal coming into Euphra, Sherry highlighted. It wasn't related to the subspace frequencies we typically use. I wasn't sure what it was then, but just now my senses indicated a signal leaving Euphra. Jam it now, Diaz ordered. She didn't need to know the details of what was going on. Any signal could be a transmission between the Rukpli and anyone else with someone outside of Euphra. Sherry pressed a few buttons. The signal has been jammed. Keep an eye out for similar signals, Diaz said. Will the person who sent out the signal know it was jammed? She didn't want to alert whoever had sent out the signal from Euphra. Not until a proper investigation was done. Unlikely, Sherry replied. But if whoever sent the signal expects a reply, eventually it will know when there's no reply. Diaz realized that Sherry had already made the assumption that the Rukpli aliens had sent the signal. Are you able to identify the source of the signal on Euphra? Diaz asked. Give me a while, Sherry said. As Diaz returned back to her seat, 2 icons on her screen began to move. The UFS Intrepid and UFS Winston were breaking orbit. Admiral Sheldon had sent her a brief on their mission. It was a risky one, but she also agreed with the objective of the mission. They couldn't afford to wait for another strike by the Rukpli. She hoped Captain Stanley could use this mission to find out more about the alien species. The truth was that there was only a limited amount of things she could do to prepare her space station crew for any attack. If Stanley could retrieve useful intelligence on the alien species, it could help them beef up their defenses on Armstrong Station. Commander, I'm unable to find the exact source of the signal, but I'm able to detect that it was sent from somewhere in Arcadia, Sherry announced. Chapter 13, Titanic Base, Arcadia. Nothing happened in the initial seconds. An uneasy silence descended on the room. The tension in the room was thick as Rames waited for the first sounds. He was about to turn to the armed man when a loud scream emerged from the chamber. The scream made the hairs on his neck stand up straight. The fact that it was loud outside the chamber alluded to how much worse it must have been inside. The Rukpli alien was out of its container. It must have recognized the trivium surrounding the chamber. Rames didn't have to worry about his back-mounted weapon. The weapon had been made unusable at the Trebium mine prior to the container being deployed. That itself would help control the Rukpli alien inside the chamber. Images had been sent to him on the attack at the Trebium mine. It had been a ferocious battle with many lives lost. Rames waited patiently for the scream to end. The armed man behind him shuffled his feet. The screaming continued for a few more seconds before it disappeared. He wasn't sure whether the screaming was another way for the Rukpli alien to communicate. He turned to the device. The live footage showed the back of the Rukpli alien. It was standing facing one corner of the chamber. It was running its arms with those blades along the chamber. Rames suspected the Rukpli alien was looking for a weakness in the chamber walls. It was time to try and begin to communicate with it. My name's Colonel Rames, Rames said. Silence greeted his words. The video footage indicated no movements from the Rukpli alien. Had it heard his words? He wasn't sure. I'm here to talk to you, Rames said a bit louder. There was no reply. Rames turned to the armed guard who shrugged. If the Rukpli alien didn't want to talk, there would be nothing he could do about it. Then Rames heard a sound. He listened closely. Why am I here? A voice hissed. It was the Rukpli alien. The video footage highlighted that the Rukpli alien had turned its head and was looking around the chamber. It must be trying to find the source of his voice. It kept glancing around. Ramas paused for a bit. What's your designation? You cannot keep me here, human, the voice growled. What's your designation? Ramas repeated. Again, there was silence. The Rukpli alien was moving about the chamber. It was still looking for something. Then a large sound emerged from the chamber. The Rukpli alien was banging its body against the walls of the chamber. The banging sound continued unabated as the Rukpli alien moved around the four walls of the chamber. The armed guard seemed ready to activate the emitter, but Ramas signaled for him to wait. If the emitter was activated, his chances of continuing the interrogation with the Rukpli alien were gone. The Rukpli alien continued going around the four walls of the chamber and smashing his body against it. Then the Rukpli alien stopped. We will exterminate every one of you for trespassing on our planet. Every one of you. It turned its head towards the recording device. Ramas grimaced. The Rukpli alien had discovered the recording device. Before he could say another word, the signal from the recording device went dead. There was no point in talking with it now. Ramas gestured for the armed man who activated the emitter, which was connected to the chamber floor. A few seconds later, another scream roared out of the chamber before dying out quickly. Chapter 14. Trebium Mine outside of tomb. Cruz moved closer to the wall. She examined her device. It wasn't malfunctioning. Her device was detecting a faint energy signal. She suspected it was coming from the other side of this wall. That meant there was a chamber or something on the other side of this wall. Is this section of the wall going to be part of the drilling? Cruz asked. Roy shook his head. We're heading in the other direction. That's probably why I noticed something on this wall. Cruz touched the wall with her fingers and fumbled around looking for a door. What are you looking for? Gerald asked. A door, Cruz replied. Ah, I found it. Her fingers found a crevice-like space and she pressed on it. Then she heard a beep, followed by a mechanical whirl as a section of the wall opened inwards. Cruz stepped back again and aimed her weapon in front of her. Stay behind me, Cruz warned as she inched closer to the door. She placed her right hand on the door and pushed it further in. Cruz walked in and her eyes widened at what was before her. In front of her was a large chamber. Although it was dimly lit, she was able to make out a 20-foot pyramid structure in the center of the chamber. There was a tinge of a moldy odor in the air. The roof of the chamber was quite high, much more than she had anticipated. Oh my goodness, Gerald whispered. By now, both Gerald and Roy had joined her inside the large chamber and were looking in awe at the pyramid structure. What's this place? Roy asked. I'm not sure, Cruz replied. Cruz glanced around. There was no sign of anyone. She walked slowly up to the edge of the pyramid structure. As she took the first few steps, a series of lights switched on across the chamber. It was only then that it dawned on her that the pyramid structure wasn't really a structure. It looked like a pyramid, but it wasn't. Instead, the structure consisted of flat and long glass boxes with metal sides on either side. The boxes had been arranged to form a pyramid. There was a black and gold insignia on the top of each box. She peered at the edge of one of those boxes. Through the top glass cover, a body lay inside the box. Initially, Cruz couldn't identify the body as the head was covered. Only once she observed the hands attached to the body did she realize it was a Rukpli alien. A dead Rukpli lay inside the box. This box was a Rukpli casket. Cruz took a step back as the realization sank into her very being. They had stumbled upon a burial site for the Rukpli alien species. What was such a burial site doing here on this planet? It wasn't anywhere near to the Rukpli homeworld. Gerald must have noticed her expression. What is it? What did you see inside the box? Roy didn't wait for her to answer as he glanced at the box. Is that what I think it is? Cruz nodded. The box contains a dead Rukpli. Gerald whistled. Is this place a burial site? Cruz looked up towards the top of the pyramid structure. There were hundreds of boxes that had been piled upon each other to form the pyramid structure. How was that possible? Was the Rukpli using this mine also as a burial site? Was that why they were after the Trebium? She didn't think the Trebium and the burial site had any connection. It was a strange place to have a burial site. Is this planet one of the places where the aliens bury the dead? Gerald asked. Cruz didn't have any answers for him. Finding the burial site had instead opened new questions to the real purpose of this planet. She had no clue as to what was really going on here. Why would the Rukpli bury their dead so far from their homeworld, wherever that was? How come the early colonists never discovered this site? Roy asked. Cruz had been thinking of the same question. Somehow the early teams that had come to Euphra had missed such a big discovery. If those teams had found this burial site, humanity may have opted to skip this planet, and then they wouldn't find themselves in such a dangerous situation. I mean, it's hidden deep in this mine, Cruz highlighted. I doubt the early colonists were looking for such things then. Then Gerald walked over to one side of the chamber. What are these? Don't touch anything, Cruz warned as she walked over to his side. Along the wall was a long glass casing with weapons inside of them. Chapter 15, Admiral's Office, UFS Central Command. Sheldon raised his eyebrows. Are you telling me someone sent out a signal from here to the Rukpli aliens? Lieutenant Diaz had requested to speak to him. Sheldon had thought it had to do with an update on the preparation of Armstrong Station, but he had been stunned to learn about a signal. Diaz hesitated. We aren't sure it's related to the Rukpli. Sheldon was unhappy. What are you sure about regarding this signal? If the Rukpli were communicating with someone on Euphra, UFS needed to intervene and stop it immediately. Were there some more Rukpli aliens left on the planet? Sheldon had been assured by General Williams that all of the Rukpli aliens had been killed, with the exception of one who had been captured and taken for further interrogation. However, there were no guarantees when dealing with the Rukpli aliens. The ambush the Rukpli remnant had set in attacking Arcadia and the Trebium mine had been effective in bringing both the mining of the Trebium to a halt and instilling fear amongst the civilian population. These days, there were no end to the media reports on the Rukpli aliens and their intentions. Sheldon had even observed many people doubting whether the Euphra defense forces could protect them and their livelihoods. Sheldon had to admit the civilians were downright scared, and they had every right to be scared. The signal seemed to use a different frequency from those that we used, Diaz said. That's what caught the attention of my people. Is it the same as the one on which we received the secret transmission? Sheldon inquired. I'm not sure, Diaz replied. That's why I took the action to jam it until we investigate the source of the signal. Sheldon was losing his patience with Diaz. Although she had done the right thing to jam the signal, Diaz needed to have all these facts before she contacted him. But are you certain the return signal came from Arcadia? Affirmative, Diaz replied. We do not know where it was heading to because we jammed it, but the origin is confirmed. Who was sending a signal out into space? Sheldon shifted in his chair. It meant there was someone or something here in Arcadia still working together with the Rukpli aliens. Chapter 16, Captain's Ready Room, UFS Intrepid. It had been hours since the UFS Intrepid and the UFS Winston had broken orbit. Stanley looked at his console. This was his first mission beyond the region of space surrounding Euphra. It was probably the first one for any UFS vessel. They were on their own out here. The navigational route to the fringe of the Vonia system where the transmission had originated from would take them several days. Despite all the advances of technology, they were limited in their space travel capabilities. Unfortunately, Admiral Sheldon had ordered Stanley to send the alien vessel down to the shipyards for further study. Stanley had tried his best to persuade Sheldon to allow the alien vessel to remain on the UFS Intrepid, but Sheldon hadn't agreed to it. He had said the engineers at the shipyards would have more time to focus on the alien vessel. Stanley had found his reasoning a bit strange as he had heard from his XO that everyone in the shipyards were busy trying their best to finish building more destroyers. Stanley suspected Sheldon was scared that the alien vessel might be lost in space. It was a reasonable thing to consider since no one knew what lay ahead for them. Stanley just hoped the engineers at the shipyards would be able to break the alien vessel down and discover a lot of the underlying technologies that the Rukpli aliens were using. It would help shed more light on the Rukpli, especially related to their ability to get their vessels to travel at faster than light speeds, which was an area that humanity still needed to catch up on. There was a buzz on his console. He opened the holoscreen. It was Captain Ronald. Yes, Captain, Stanley asked. Is there anything I need to take note of? Ronald asked. Stanley realized the junior captain was seeking guidance from him. Unfortunately to Stanley, everything on this mission was also new to him. They had to be wary out here in space. They couldn't discount the reality that there could be Rukpli alien vessels roaming around. And Stanley had to admit that he himself hadn't taken the time to brief Captain Ronald much on what to expect. Make sure your sensor officer keeps an eye on the scans at all times, Stanley advised. We might run into Rukpli vessels. Ronald nodded. Captain, there's one more thing. I found the package you sent over to us. Stanley frowned. Package? It was inside one of the shuttles from the shipyards, Ronald explained. I was surprised too. Stanley interrupted him. What are you talking about? I didn't send you anything. Are you sure it was me? Ronald brought up a small black box onto the holoscreen. My XO just delivered this to me a few minutes ago. It has your name on the front of it. Initially, I thought it was meant for you, but then I realized you were the sender of it. Stanley leaned forward. He didn't send anything to Ronald. What was going on? Then his eyes widened. Captain, take that package now and get rid of it. But Ronald seemed confused. I think it's a bomb. Dump it out into space now. Chapter 17, Trebium Mine, outside of Tomb. The long glass casing wasn't completely filled with weapons. Some of the weapons inside were falling apart. A few of them seemed to be still in good condition. Crews suspected these weapons were buried here with the Rukpli in this burial site. It must have been part of their burial process. It reminded her of an ancient Earth civilization that used to bury the person alongside some of his or her possessions. It was interesting that an alien civilization far away from Earth would also follow such a practice. Most of these weapons look old, Gerald remarked. Cruz nodded. They must have been buried here years ago, but I do see a couple of newer ones. She walked along the long casing that extended the length of the pyramid structure. The weapons that worked could help them in their fight against the Rukpli. Gerald pointed at the pyramid structure. Is this why the aliens want this planet back? I don't know, Cruz replied. She hoped that wasn't the case. If it was, they were in serious trouble. Humanity had spent years upon years building Euphra. There was no way they could abandon it because of the discovery of the Rukpli burial site. It would be near impossible to find another planet like Euphra in the Vonia system. Could there be many more burial sites like this one on Euphra, Roy asked. It's possible, Gerald replied. I doubt the aliens only used one site on this entire planet as a burial site. But if they used it as a burial site, why didn't the aliens show up when we humans arrived here? Cruz asked. It has been so long. She also wasn't sure when this burial site had been used last by the Rukpli. It couldn't have been too long ago, since some of the weapons appeared to be in good condition. Then Cruz stopped walking. A black device on the ground inside the casing caught her eye. There wasn't much dust on the device. What was it? She stooped over the glass casing and tried to determine what the device was, but she couldn't figure it out. The device was clearly out of place against all other weapons. And yet it was inside the glass casing. She turned and looked at the two men. Both of them were still enthralled further away at the other Rukpli weapons. She had to admit that the weapons themselves were impressive, even to her. She took her weapon and used it to smash the casing. The sound of breaking glass disturbed the silence of the chamber. The two men leaped back as if someone was about to attack them. Cruz turned around, half expecting one or more of the Rukpli to emerge from the boxes. It's just me, Cruz shouted, and pointed at the broken glass in front of her. Both men relaxed and began to approach her. Without waiting for them, she put her hand inside, trying her best to avoid the glass shards, and carefully picked up the black device. It was small and rectangular in shape. Cruz wiped off the minute amount of dust on the device. There were a few buttons in the front of it. The device reminded her of a smaller version of the emitters they had brought over to Trebium mine. What is it, Gerald asked. I'm not sure yet, but it might help us break the force field, Cruz suggested. To be honest, it was a far-fetched theory. She didn't even know what the device did, let alone whether it could bring down a Rukpli force field. But it had to be of significance if it had been buried here next to the pyramid structure. How will we know if it works, Roy asked. We won't until we try it out, Cruz said. But first, I need to get a translation for these symbols. Some of these other weapons are usable, Gerald highlighted. Once we get out of the mine, I'll get my guys to come and take these weapons, Cruz said. We'll need every one of them to fight the Rukpli. But now we need to focus on this device. Chapter 18, Deck 2, UFS Winston. It had been a minute since Captain Ronald had gently stepped out of his ready room. In his hands was the small package that had supposedly been sent to him by Captain Stanley. But Stanley hadn't sent anything to him, and he had indicated that it may be a bomb of some kind. The moment he had heard those words from Stanley, his heart had begun to pound. His comms crackled with his XO Commander Clifford's voice. Captain, I'm on my way to dump this package out into space, Ronald announced. There had been no time to wait for one of his officers to reach his ready room. He had to get rid of the package as soon as possible. He tried his best to keep his hands from shaking. Never had he expected that someone would target him. He was only recently promoted to captain. He wasn't a threat to anyone, but it looked like he was a threat to someone. It had to be the Rukpli aliens. There was no one else who would need to target him. I sent 2 men to escort you, sir, his XO highlighted. Affirmative, Ronald replied as he slowly walked down the corridor with one eye on the package. Wait for my signal to move the vessel away. He didn't know how much time was left before the bomb exploded. Ronald tried his best not to focus on such thoughts. He just needed a few more minutes. 2 men appeared behind him. Captain, you can pass the package to me, one of the men said. Ronald shook his head. I'm okay with it. There was no need to risk moving the package around too much. Once they reached the room, one of his men opened the door and they all slipped inside. One of his men raced forward and opened the chute. Ronald walked up towards the chute, placed the package inside of it, and stepped back. The man who had opened the chute closed it and pressed on the panel beside it. There was a sound and the object was ejected into space. Ronald spoke to his XO on the comms. Commander, get us clear of that object now. He felt the UFS Winston lurch forward as the vessel tried to put some distance between it and the package. They were just in time. Captain, the package just, one of his men stated. Ronald interrupted him. I know. Return to your stations. He turned away and left the room. His heart was still pounding. He couldn't believe how close he had come to certain death, but he couldn't show his fear in front of his men. He needed to stay in control. As he made his way down the corridor back towards the ready room, he realized his hands were still shaking from the near-death experience. No training had prepared him for such a scenario, but he decided not to let it consume his thoughts. Instead, he began to focus on the package. Who had sent the package? Obviously someone on Euphra was working against them. It couldn't be a human, or could it? His exo's voice came on his comms. Captain, we were very fortunate. The explosion took place at distance on the starboard side. There was no impact from the explosion to our ship. Actually, Ronald realized that he was very lucky. If he hadn't checked in with Stanley, he would be dead by now. And their mission to the fringe of the Vonia system would have ended before it even started. Can you check where that package came from? Ronald ordered. Affirmative, Clifford replied. Once Ronald reached the ready room, he stepped inside, took a seat, and opened a holoscreen with Stanley. By this time, his hands had stopped shaking. A few moments later, Stanley's face appeared. Our sensors detected the explosion, Stanley said. Ronald nodded. I'm checking on the source of that package. Was there anything else that came with that package? Stanley asked. Why? Because that may not be the only bomb that was planted on your vessel, Stanley warned. Get your men to do a sweep of all the items from that shuttle. More bombs? Ronald couldn't believe Stanley's words, but he was right. They couldn't eliminate that possibility without a thorough check of all the packages. Will do, Ronald replied and switched off the holoscreen. Chapter 19. Bridge, UFS Intrepid. The moment Stanley had realized that the package sent to Captain Ronald was a bomb, he activated his own team to search all the contents that had been brought up from the shuttles. Whoever had planted these packages had access to the shuttles at the shipyards. He opened the holoscreen with Admiral Sheldon, who seemed unhappy to see him. Stanley, I didn't expect any update from you, Sheldon remarked. You couldn't have reached the destination yet, right? Admiral, we have a problem, Stanley said, and shared what had happened in the last several minutes on board the UFS Winston. Sheldon looked away briefly before returning his attention to the holoscreen. That means someone has infiltrated Euphra's shipyards. It must be the Rukpli aliens. But I thought the Rukpli couldn't penetrate the Trebium exterior of the domes at the shipyard, Stanley countered. They cannot, but if the Rukpli jumped into a human body, they could, Sheldon stated. The Admiral's assessment was on point. A Rukpli had been able to infiltrate one of the humans at Euphra's shipyards. Stanley didn't know how that could have happened, but it seemed to make the most sense. Sheldon was shaking his head in dismay. Stanley understood the implication. It could be anyone in the shipyards. How many people are currently in the dome? Stanley asked. There are hundreds of them, Sheldon replied. But we need to find this infiltrator. If not, it could sabotage the rest of the destroyers that are under construction. Stanley was unable to grasp how they were going to find one Rukpli alien amongst hundreds of the humans down in the shipyards. It seemed like an impossible task. It would take a lot of time to find it. I'll inform General Williams about it, Sheldon said. Although they are still dealing with the force field around the Trebium mine, he needs to be kept updated. With that, the holoscreen switched off. Mendez's voice came over his private comms. Captain, we found a similar package and disposed of it immediately. It was destined to your ready room, but someone forgot to pick it up and send it to you. Stanley frowned. Did it explode? As if in answer to that, a shudder rolled through the vessel. That was it, sir, Mendez remarked. Did you search the rest? Stanley asked. Yes, there wasn't anything else, his exo commented. I think whoever sent this wanted to be discreet about it. Whoever had sent these two packages wanted to ensure both captains died during their journey to the fringe of the Vonia system. Did that mean the Rukpli aliens were expecting them? He wasn't so sure. They would still need to be ready for it. Chapter 20. Trebium Mine outside of Tomb. Cruz waited as Peters looked at her device. Her device displayed an image of the symbols on the black device she had retrieved from the Rukpli burial site. She had returned to the front of the mine entrance with Gerald, Roy, and the black device. Everyone had been glad to see them return. Cruz had been pleased to find Faulkner still awake when they had returned. She had been afraid that he might have fallen asleep. First light had begun to creep over the horizon, and most of the miners had also been awake. Gerald and Roy had gone over to talk to the rest of the miners. Then Peter showed her his device. I will send it out to Lieutenant Diaz for translation. Cruz nodded. It wouldn't take long to get back to translation. She realized the rest of Peter's unit had also assembled outside the force field. Peters was typing again on his device. What else do we know about this Rukpli burial site? Cruz replied to him with a message. It seems to be quite old in the sense that it has been in this location for a while. Some of the weapons stored inside the burial site are coming apart, but there are also other weapons which are newer. I think this burial site has been used for a while. Peter sent her a reply, and yet no one was able to detect it for so long. Cruz shrugged when she saw his message. Peter was shaking his head in frustration as he sent another message. Are we able to use some of those newer weapons? Cruz replied to him. Yes, all those weapons which are in good condition should be usable. They will help us in our fight against the Rukpli. Peters acknowledged her. Cruz was about to turn back and check on the rest of the group when Peters smiled and showed her the device. Her eyes widened. It was the translation of the symbols to the controls on the device. She raised her fist. Yes. Everyone else inside the mine glanced in her direction. Cruz looked flustered and motioned for them to continue what they were doing. Faulkner walked over to her side. What is it? The symbols on this device may help us break through the force field, Cruz explained. Faulkner looked confused. How? According to the translations I just got from my captain, this device appears to be the kind that is used to set up fields around various objects, Cruz commented. You mean like a force field? Faulkner asked. Cruz nodded. Then let's get it working, Faulkner chimed in. The excitement in his voice was so evident. The lifeless and demotivated Faulkner had disappeared. A new strength had entered his words. Cruz motioned to Peters to step back. Peters and the rest of the unit stepped away from the force field. She put the device on the ground and pressed on the button to start it up. It took a few seconds before she heard a beep from the device. Her heart was pounding. Based on the translations from Diaz, the next two buttons consisted of enabling and disabling a force field. Would it work on this particular force field? Was this device too old to neutralize the force field? Cruz pushed all those thoughts aside as she knelt beside the device and examined the buttons. Here we go, Cruz whispered. She took a deep breath and pressed the button to disable the force field. Cruz looked up at the force field. There was no visible change, but that didn't mean anything. Did it work? Faulkner asked. His impatience was beginning to irritate her. I'm not sure, Cruz replied as she continued to stare ahead. Before she could say another word, Faulkner picked up a rock and threw it in the direction of the force field. That hurt. One of the men outside the force field shouted and jumped backwards. The device had worked. The force field had been disabled. Chapter 21, Euphra Shipyards, Arcadia. Lieutenant Storen stood at the door peering through the glass panel at the space that they had assigned to Dr. Humphreys. The Rukpli inside of him looked intently at the sample Humphreys was examining. It felt the urge to strike down the door, kill Humphreys and the junior officer, and take the samples. How dare the humans run experiments on the Rukpli? But the Rukpli inside of Storen realized it couldn't do that. The instructions it had sent to the superiors should have reached him by now. The Supreme Leader would have gotten his observations. It had to wait to hear from the Supreme Leader on what next needed to be done. The reason it had been planted as a seed was to stay undercover and wait it out amongst the humans. Storen was about to step into the room when his comms buzzed. It was Admiral Sheldon. Storen frowned. He didn't want to speak to the Admiral at this moment, but he realized there was no choice. Storen opened his comms link. Admiral, Lieutenant, we have a serious issue that needs attention, Sheldon admitted. The Rukpli inside Storen grimaced. It didn't like taking all these orders from Admiral Sheldon. It was unfortunate that the other Rukpli had failed to take out the last remaining admiral amongst the humans. If that had happened, it would have been easier to overwhelm the humans and destroy them. But that didn't matter right now. The Rukpli had to be patient. It tried to listen to whatever Admiral Sheldon had to say. The human species had this tendency to talk about everything at length, even when it wasn't necessary. There's a spy among us, Sheldon announced. We think it's a Rukpli inside a human body. The Rukpli inside Storen frowned. How did the humans get this intelligence? How do we know this? Storen asked. Someone at the shipyards sent 2 bombs to the captains on the UFS Intrepid and the UFS Winston, Sheldon highlighted. Storen pretended to be shocked. What happened to them? Nothing. They managed to eject the bombs before they exploded, Sheldon replied. It was a close call, but those packages came from the shuttles that were launched from the shipyard. There's a spy among your people. The Rukpli inside Storen was irritated. The packages it had sent to the destroyers had failed in their purpose. It had taken a great risk of exposure in sending those packages, but those had been its previous instructions. Now the humans knew of the spy. At the time of preparing the packages, it hadn't questioned the risk of exposure. No one questioned the Supreme Leader. Instead, it had followed the instructions. The Rukpli inside Storen realized that the time it had on Euphra was running out. Admiral, what do you want me to do? Storen asked. Keep your eyes open for anything unusual, Sheldon stated. Storen, I'm not supposed to tell anyone, but I trust you with this information. Storen smiled. Of course, sir. I will discreetly increase the patrols around the domes. Also, find out who had left the protection of the domes in the last week, Sheldon demanded. Once you have the list, you can share that with me. It should be one of them. The Rukpli inside Storen nodded. I'll do that. With that, the comms went dead. Storen turned around and walked back to his workstation. Humphreys would have to wait. He needed to deal with this situation. The Rukpli inside Storen knew that the humans would come searching for him. It was inevitable. But first, he had to prepare a list for the Admiral. Chapter 22, Deck 2, Mess Hall, UFS Intrepid. Squadron Leader Harris took a sip of the drink as he stared outside the window into space. The UFS Intrepid was on its way to strike back at the Rukpli aliens. His squadron of pilots had been deployed to support the UFS Intrepid. They were the first batch of pilots from Euphra about to see real space combat. The day Admiral Sheldon had broken the news to him, he had felt proud and excited, not only for himself but also for his squadron. There was no equal to serving his people. This was what he and his squadron had been preparing themselves for. They were about to put into action everything they had learned. All those training drills and simulated experiences were about to bear fruit. Captain Stanley stepped into the mess hall. Harris waved to him and he walked over and sat down across from him. "Harris, it's nice to meet you," Stanley announced as he extended his hands. "I didn't get a chance to catch up with you earlier when you and your pilots boarded the UFS Intrepid, as I was busy attending to several matters." Harris shook his hands. "Captain, I understand. These are difficult times for everyone on Euphra." "How are your pilots?" Stanley asked. "They are nervous but ready for combat," Harris replied firmly. That was far from the truth, but he didn't want to burden the captain with such details. The captain of a destroyer had much more important things to worry about than the state of mind of his squadron. And in reality, no one could say confidently that they were ready, not until the moment of truth came upon them and they were facing down their enemy. That would be the true test of their readiness. "I understand the fighter ships haven't been tested out much," Stanley remarked. "Most of our training was over the Stanton Desert," Harris commented. "We have done a few in orbit and around Euphra, but nothing beats being in deep space." "I don't think we'll have time for any training on this mission," Stanley said. Harris had also been informed they didn't have the time to move any training simulators on board this vessel. That was unfortunate because he could have used the time to run more simulations for the pilots. "Captain, how much do we know about the Rukpli squadron capabilities?" Harris asked. He wanted to try and give his pilots any advantage they could get. Any information would help. Stanley shook his head. "We don't know anything. For now, just make sure your squadron is ready. I don't know what we are heading into when we reach our destination." It was what Harris had feared. His squadron would have to learn on the fly, facing an unknown enemy. "Affirmative," Harris nodded. Stanley stood and left the mess hall. Harris had heard much of Stanley during the last 3 months. Most of it was good. He hoped that would continue to be the case. He checked his device. It was time to meet his squadron. This was going to be his first briefing with them ever since they had boarded the UFS Intrepid. Chapter 23. Titanic Base, Arcadia. Peters leaned back on his chair. It was good to be back. The last few weeks had been intense with the Rukpli aliens. With the bringing down of the force field, Peters had been able to bring that matter to a close. He had assigned 2 new Marine units to keep guard over the Trebium mine. Although the force field was down and there were no signs of any other Rukpli aliens, he wasn't going to take a chance. Captain Faulkner had been reassigned to another post away from the mine. Faulkner had accepted it without any debate. The discovery of the Rukpli burial site and the retrieval of some of the weapons was currently ongoing. He had left crews in charge of it. He expected it to take another day or so. Peters looked at his workstation. The list of the names of the dead was long. He sighed as he glanced through the list. So many young soldiers had died. All the bodies of the dead Marines had been brought back to Titanic Base. He would personally contact the next of kin for every one of them. It was something General Myers had taught him early on when he decided to serve. A few hours later, his workstation buzzed. Peters opened the holoscreen. It was General Williams. "Captain, I saw your report on the Trebium mine situation," Williams said. "Do you think the Rukpli are upset because they are mining their Trebium so close to their burial site?" Peters had contemplated that as well, but he didn't think it was the case. "I don't think so, sir," Peters replied. "That burial site cannot be the only one the Rukpli use. And if that was the case, why didn't they show up when we arrived on Euphra?" Williams touched his chin. "I guess we can find all this out when we run into them again. I have another sensitive mission for you, but this is for your ears only." Peters narrowed his eyes. "Sensitive?" Williams shared with Peters on the Rukpli spy amongst one of the people at Euphra shipyards and what had nearly happened aboard the 2 destroyers en route to the fringe of the Vonia system. Peters paused for a bit. "That means it's inside a human body." Just when he had thought that the Rukpli aliens had all left Euphra, it appeared that was no longer true. "But this one may be slightly different from the one you encountered on Armstrong Station," Williams said. "How so?" "This Rukpli is being extremely careful," Williams suggested. "But now that we know about it, we'll be able to find it quickly," Peters said. "I did a check with Sheldon on the number of people working at the shipyards," Williams remarked. "It's literally in the hundreds." Peters understood the implication. This particular Rukpli alien had been intelligent to choose an area in Arcadia where there were many humans. This would make the search process quite challenging. "I don't believe Sheldon can flush the Rukpli out," Williams admitted. "That's why I'm sending you and you alone into the shipyards. If I send an entire Marine unit, it would tip off the Rukpli and it might run and cause more havoc." You cannot trust anyone down at the shipyards. Proceed with caution. I will leave it up to you to develop a reason for visiting the shipyards. Affirmative, Peter said, and the holoscreen went blank. He agreed with William's assessment on Sheldon. Despite that, it wouldn't be easy going about the shipyards. In time to come, people would become suspicious. He needed to find a way to identify the human hosting the Rukpli alien as quickly as possible and take it out. There was no telling what else it was up to right now. Peters glanced back at the list of the dead Marines. He was down to the last few names on the list. The last few hours had been exhausting contacting the next of kin. After he completed that, he would begin thinking of his mission to the Euphra shipyard. Chapter 24. Bridge, UFS Intrepid. Stanley glanced at the bridge crew. They were a day or two away from the fringe of the Vonia system, where the secret transmission had supposedly originated from. His XO had been rotating the bridge crew to give them the necessary rest in preparation for whatever was ahead of them. Stanley had also been relieved to hear that Captain Ronald and his team hadn't found any more suspicious packages. Whoever had sent the packages had been specific in wanting to take out both captains. It fit perfectly into the strategy that the Rukpli aliens had previously employed. They seemed to always want to target the leaders, similar to how they had taken out the admirals and commanders of the UFS. Although the scare from the bombs was over, Stanley had advised Ronald to be on alert at all times. While the UFS Intrepid and the UFS Winston had the Trebium exterior, the Rukpli were crafty in finding ways to circumvent the Trebium hulls and get on board the vessels. Stanley had even gone to the extent to get Commander Mendez to check through the crew manifest for anything suspicious. Stanley didn't want to be complacent when dealing with the Rukpli aliens. Fortunately, his XO's search of the manifest hadn't surfaced anything suspicious. It had helped put Stanley's mind at ease. His XO turned to him. Captain, what are we expecting when you reach the position? Stanley shook his head. It could be a base or an outpost. What if it's neither? Mendez asked. Stanley hoped that wouldn't be the case. If not, they would have wasted a lot of resources and time to get over to the position. But he sensed there was something for them to find. It couldn't be a random chance that someone would send a secret message at the same time the Rukpli aliens had initiated the first attack on the admirals and commanders of the UFS. He had speculated that there could be someone who is sympathetic to them amongst the Rukpli aliens. Stanley realized he was being hopeful. Captain, we are detecting something on our long-range sensors, the sensor officer announced. Stanley turned his attention to the screen, put it on and magnified it. This was unusual. They were still at least a day away from the designated position related to the source of the transmission. The bridge view screen changed to display an object in space. The magnification didn't help identify it. Are we able to identify it? Stanley asked. Scanning now, sir, the sensor officer replied. From his vantage point, it didn't look like space debris. The object seemed to be intact, but was stationary. Was this a trap set by the Rukpli? Stanley couldn't discount that possibility. I'd advise we slow down and hold our position, Mendez advised. Stanley agreed. Slow us down and inform the UFS Winstons to do likewise. Aye, Captain, the navigation officer replied. Then the sensor officer turned to Stanley. Captain, it's a vessel. And from the look of it, the comms officer interrupted him. Sir, the vessel is emitting a distress signal. Chapter 25. Euphra Shipyards, Arcadia. Peters flashed his identification card to the armed guards at the main entrance to Euphra shipyards. He had come in civilian clothes, although he was carrying a concealed weapon and was wearing the Trebium armor. Initially, the armed guards hadn't recognized him and had demanded the proper authorization to enter the premises. Peters was pleased that the guards were being vigilant. That's what he expected of them. Once they recognized him, the guards saluted and apologized profusely for their mistake in not recognizing him sooner. Peters had commended them for being careful and stepped into the shipyards. He was glad they didn't ask where he was heading to. If he had to answer that, it would have made things a bit complicated. Based on General Williams' concerns, Peters had chosen not to inform anyone of his arrival to the shipyards. Not even Admiral Sheldon or Lieutenant Storen. It was better this way. He didn't know how far the Rukpli had infiltrated the shipyards. Williams was going under the assumption that a single Rukpli alien had infiltrated the facility. However, they couldn't simply make that assumption. From his recent experience with the Rukpli, they seemed to destroy any and all assumptions. There could be multiple Rukpli aliens hiding in this facility. Peters recalled the domes was the one place the Rukpli hadn't been able to penetrate. At that time, they had been after Admiral Sheldon, but now their objective must be different. Who were they after? Or maybe they weren't after any one person. It could be that they wanted to sabotage the building of the destroyers. Peters approached the first dome. It was the same one he had been at before when his unit had been sent to rescue Admiral Sheldon. He stopped and glanced around. The area was deserted. He walked up to the door and a guard appeared from inside. Peters flashed his identification and the armed guard smiled, saluted and opened the door. Captain, we didn't expect you, the armed guard said. Peter smiled. Just doing a quick check and I'll be on my way. Is Humphreys in this dome? Yes, sir, the armed guard replied. He's on level 1 below. Do you need me to show you the way? That won't be necessary, Peter said. I know my way around. It was a lie, but he didn't want to have an escort and attract any attention. The guard acknowledged him and returned to his station as Peters walked down the corridor. At the end of the corridor, he took the stairs down to the next level. Once he reached the door, he peered through the glass panel. Humphreys and a junior officer were inside. They seemed engrossed by the experiments. Peters opened the door and stepped inside. Humphreys looked up. "I'm sorry. Oh, Captain Peters, I didn't recognize you out of your uniform." The moment the junior officer heard Humphreys' words, he straightened up and saluted. "At ease," Peters said. Humphreys introduced the junior officer. "This is Officer Ryan. He's been assigned to kindly assist me, although I believe he is also here to protect me." Peters noted the tone of Humphreys' last few words. The junior officer wouldn't be able to protect the chief scientist if one of the military Rukpli agents barged in here. Humphreys knew it. "The Trebium exterior on this dome should provide adequate protection for you," Peters remarked. "So what brings you here?" Humphreys asked. Peters moved closer to Humphreys. "I wanted to check on your progress." "Somehow you don't seem dressed for that," Humphreys smirked. "As to our progress, we have made a remarkable discovery. We, or I, believe that the Rukpli are able to communicate at the cellular level. I believe it's the same way the Rukpli cells triggered those military Rukpli types to look for me at Science Division 1. Peters was taken back by that revelation. "How certain are you of that?" It wasn't that he doubted the chief scientist. Humphreys had been pivotal in discovering the effect of the ultrasonic sound on the Rukpli aliens. That itself had prevented a catastrophic outcome during the last engagement with the Rukpli. "Come a bit closer and I will demonstrate it to you," Humphreys said. Chapter 26, Bridge, UFS Intrepid. Stanley ordered the weapons to be powered up and ready. "Any life signs?" Stanley asked. "Unable to confirm," the sensor officer reported. "It could be a trap," his XO whispered. Mendez probably remembered what had happened when they had discovered the UFS Brennan. That had been a trap the Rukpli agents had set to get access to his vessel. Mendez must have sensed his hesitation. A distress call could have been activated automatically by the systems in the vessel. That was a possibility, but they still needed to respond to it. "Captain, we have new contacts appearing on the starboard side," the sensor officer replied. "More contacts on the aft side, too. Prepare to engage," Stanley ordered. It had been a trap to distract him. However, since they hadn't engaged with the floating vessel, the Rukpli agents had decided to make their presence known. "How many vessels?" Mendez asked. "2 on the starboard and 2 more on the aft," tactical officer replied. Again, Stanley was astonished at the speed with which the Rukpli alien vessels had appeared out of nowhere. "Are they in weapons range?" Stanley asked. "Not yet," the tactical officer reported. The bridge view screen flickered and the first signs of the 4 ships appeared. 2 of them were of the same shape and size as those they had previously encountered around Euphra. The other 2 vessels were of a different configuration. They appeared to be larger vessels, but still half the size of the UFS Intrepid. "Hail them," Stanley directed. He also sent an alert to Harris and his squadron. Based on their previous engagements, Stanley doubted they were going to be able to negotiate with the Rukpli species. Chapter 27, Euphra Shipyards, Arcadia. Peters looked on in awe at what he was witnessing in front of his very eyes. Ryan's device was detecting a signal between the 2 samples containing Rukpli cells. "You still don't seem convinced," Humphreys stated. Peters had to admit that Humphreys was very perceptive. The chief scientist must have seen something in his facial expression. "What you're showing me is incredible, but I'm not sure," Peters commented. "Ryan, have you checked your device for any malfunctions?" "Yes, sir," Ryan replied. "Just like you, I wasn't convinced at first. Initially, I felt that my device was either defective or malfunctioning, but after several trials, I'm now convinced." "Captain, why don't you try your device?" Humphreys suggested. Humphreys was being extremely patient with him. It was probably one of those distinguishing hallmarks of being a scientist. Peters fished out his device and switched it on. "My device isn't detecting anything." "Of course it wouldn't," Humphreys said. "Stand over there between the 2 samples and wait for it." Peters decided to indulge the chief scientist. He moved into the position that Humphreys had pointed to. However, his device didn't register anything. He was about to say something when he noticed a reading on his device. It hadn't been there before, but it was there now. Peters leaned in and examined it. Then he stared between the 2 samples. There was no visible movement in either of the samples. Humphreys smiled in triumph. "I told you." "How's that possible?" Peters asked in disbelief. "I don't have an answer for you yet," Humphreys replied. "It's specific to the Rukpli cell structure." "Captain, it means the Rukpli aliens can communicate without any equipment," Ryan admitted. "If it was true, this discovery was even bigger than the emitter and the ultrasonic sound. We need to find out the distance at which the Rukpli can communicate using their cells," Peters said. Humphreys grinned as he pointed his crooked finger at him. "Now, that's something I can figure out." Just as he finished saying that, there was a sound near the door. Peters turned. It was Storen. Peters breathed a sigh of relief. Storen waved at him. The Rukpli inside Storen frowned. Chapter 28, Briefing Room, UFS Intrepid. Squadron Leader Harris was nearly towards the end of his briefing when he received the alert from Captain Stanley. He hadn't expected it so soon, although he had heard through the grapevine that the UFS Intrepid had encountered a floating object in space. Harris was just glad he had made the time to get the briefing over with before the alert had come. His pilots were still new to this and he hoped he had been successful in setting the expectations. Harris didn't want his pilots to try any unnecessary heroics. There were too few of them in his squadron. He couldn't afford to lose any of them in the battle ahead. "Everyone, get to your fighter ships now," Harris barked. The men and women in his squadron quickly stood and emptied out the briefing room. A few minutes later, Harris was seated inside his own fighter ship. These fighter vessels hadn't been inherited from Earth. Instead, they had been specially built once humanity had settled down in Euphra. However, they didn't have the special Trebium hulls as the new breed of destroyers. It didn't matter to Harris. He and his squadron were wearing the Trebium armor. That should prevent any Rukpli alien from jumping into their human bodies and taking control of one of the fighter ships. Once Harris had secured his headset, he glanced around at the hangar bay. "Everyone, stand by for launch." Stanley's voice crackled over his private comms link. "Harris, is the squadron ready?" "Affirmative, Captain," Harris replied. "We have 4 ships out there," Stanley explained. 2 of them are half the size of our destroyer. I suspect those 2 will launch fighter ships once we launch your squadron. You need to be ready to take them out and run interference for us while we try to take out the bigger Rukpli vessels. "Got it," Harris said, and the comms went dead. This was it. His squadron was about to head out to its first combat experience against an unknown and deadly enemy. They had no information on what kind of fighter ships the Rukpli aliens might have. His squadron was going to have to learn it on the go. He got a message on his headset. They had gotten the green light to launch. "Launch confirmed," Harris ordered his squadron. Harris navigated his fighter ship towards the hangar bay exit. In a few seconds, his fighter ship was out in space, followed by another 10 belonging to his squadron. Chapter 29. Bridge, UFS Intrepid. "Captain, the squadron has launched," Mendez reported. The fighter ships led by Harris began to emerge onto the view screen. This was Euphra's first squadron. At any other time, Stanley would have felt proud, but right now, he needed to keep his focus on the Rukpli alien vessels. "Any reply to our hail?" Stanley asked. Although he had no intention of negotiating with the Rukpli aliens, he still needed to try and contact them. "Negative, sir," the comms officer replied. "Sir, we are in weapons range now," the tactical officer announced. "Fire at the floating object," Stanley ordered. His exo cleared his throat. Stanley knew Mendez was confused by what he was doing. Firing at a supposedly empty floating vessel was pointless and a waste of resources. But his exo didn't know he had a plan to disrupt the enemy's expectations. "So we're detecting fighter ships emerging from one of the larger Rukpli vessels," the sensor officer reported. "And it appears to be that there are a lot of them." Stanley had expected a reaction, but not so soon. He hoped Harris and his squadron were up to the challenge. The UFS Intrepid only had 1 squadron to deal with, the Rukpli fighters. Firing away at the object, the tactical officer said. The slugs streaked towards the floating object. The Rukpli and the 4 vessels didn't fire anything to intercept the slugs. Stanley was sure the Rukpli vessels would have detected their weapons fire. Either they were ignoring it or hadn't had the time to react to the unusual action. "We got multiple direct hits," the tactical officer reported. The floating vessels took direct hits and exploded, leaving behind a debris field. "The Rukpli vessels are moving away from the explosion," the sensor officer said. Stanley had been waiting for that. The Rukpli aliens would be wondering what he was doing, but that was the opening he wanted. "Signal the UFS Winston to concentrate their fire on the 2 larger vessels," Stanley ordered. Chapter 30. Cockpit, UFS Fighter Ship. Lieutenant Grayson pushed on her navigational controls as her fighter ship streaked ahead towards a group of Rukpli fighters. The Rukpli vessels seemed a bit smaller than her own fighter ship, but there were many of them streaming out of one of the Rukpli vessels. The adrenaline was pumping. She could feel it over every part of her body. Her chance to fight back against the Rukpli aliens had finally arrived. Ever since she had heard of the Rukpli attack against the admirals and commanders and the subsequent attacks on Arcadia, Grayson had been waiting for the opportunity to return the favor. "Engage and let's take them down," Harris ordered. "Affirmative," Grayson said. The Rukpli fighters began to disperse and fly in different directions. Grayson set her target on one towards the aft side and pursued it. She let loose and fired her weapons at it. The Rukpli fighter evaded her weapons fire and roared past her. "You aren't getting away so easily," Grayson muttered under her breath as she veered her fighter ship in pursuit of that Rukpli vessel. "Grayson, heads up," Harris shouted. "You have 1 bogey on your tail." Grayson pulled on the navigation controls and her entire body slammed into her seat. The maneuver helped her break away from the Rukpli fighter on her tail. Moments later, her view screen had the Rukpli fighter in its sight. Grayson fired again. This time, the weapons fire found its target and the Rukpli fighter exploded in a blinding light. "Nice shot," a voice crackled over the comms. "Grayson, incoming on your starboard side," Harris said. Grayson turned her fighter ship only to find 2 bogies on a direct intercept path with her. She fired her weapons at them. The 2 Rukpli fighters split away from the intercept path successfully evading her weapons fire. "I'm on them," Harris remarked. Grayson clenched her fists. From the corner of her eye, one of the Rukpli fighters that had evaded her weapons fire was blown up into pieces. She targeted the other one and managed to hit it with her weapons fire. She smiled as her fighter ship flew through the debris of the blown-up Rukpli vessel. "We have multiple bogies incoming," Harris shouted. "Move them towards the larger Rukpli vessel. The rest of you target your weapons fire on that ship." Chapter 31, Euphra Shipyards, Arcadia. Lieutenant Storen stepped inside the room with Peters, Humphreys, and the officer. The Rukpli inside Storen was trying its best to stay under control. It had tapped into the memories of Storen to find out everything it needed about the new human in the room. Once it had retrieved those memories, the Rukpli inside Storen felt a sense of panic. The very fact that Captain Peters was here meant the humans knew about it. Peters wouldn't have made a random, unannounced trip to the shipyard. The captain had intentionally arrived quietly to try and find it. "Storen, it's good to see you again," Peter said. "Captain, I didn't know you were coming to the shipyard," Storen said, "but it's always a pleasure to have you here." "Your container worked perfectly," Peters admitted. Storen had a blank expression on his face before he recovered. The Rukpli inside Storen quickly acknowledged Peters' statement. It hoped that Peters hadn't noticed anything unusual. It had forgotten that the host human body had been the mastermind behind the development of the container that had captured one of its own. Being part of the seed segment of the Rukpli species, the Rukpli inside Storen knew it had been stripped of all emotions once it had been deployed to Euphra. However, it felt the lingering traces of those emotions. A tinge of rage had surfaced once it realized that the host human body was the reason that one of its own was now trapped by this disgusting species. In time to come, this host human body would pay dearly for creating that container. But now wasn't the time. It had to wait. As the seed segment of the Rukpli, it had undergone considerable training on how to engage and remain dormant within a host body. The human body was no different from any other species, except in one area. The human tendency to be dominated by emotions was something it hadn't expected. At times, the human emotions seemed to overwhelm every part of the host body. If the humans were here looking for it, that meant only one thing. The humans had been able to detect its transmission to its superiors. It didn't know how that was possible. Even so, had the humans been able to decrypt the message, there was no way to determine that. But the humans must have identified the source of its transmission, which had led to Peter's presence here today. "What's going on?" Storen asked calmly. Humphreys turned to him. "We have uncovered that the Rukpli are able to communicate at the cell level. It's amazing." Storen's eyes widened. "That sounds incredible." The Rukpli inside Storen froze. The humans were moving faster than he had expected. Their ability to uncover things about the Rukpli concerned it. This information would need to be conveyed to the Supreme Leader as soon as possible. Then the Supreme Leader would be able to develop a new strategy against the humans. However, the Rukpli inside Storen needed to first deal with Captain Peters. It couldn't allow Peters to simply walk around the shipyard. It would only be a matter of time before Peters began to suspect it. The Rukpli inside Storen again felt the pull of the human emotions trying to take charge. Despite that, the Rukpli inside Storen had an advantage. Within Storen's memories, it had been able to find out that the humans had no way to detect the Rukpli within a host human body. That meant Peters couldn't detect it, even if it was standing right next to him. Then, several things happened at once to the Rukpli inside Storen's dismay. The young officer behind Humphreys jumped back. "Did you see it? Did you see it?" Peters looked at the sample and then turned back to look at it. The Rukpli inside Storen realized its time of staying hidden was up. Storen pulled out his weapon. Chapter 32, Bridge, UFS Intrepid. "Captain, the UFS Winston has unleashed its missiles on the smaller vessels," the sensor officer reported. Stanley smiled. Captain Ronald was a fast learner. The young captain recalled what they had done in the previous encounter with the Rukpli alien vessel. The smaller Rukpli vessels were taking evasive actions. "Our squadron is taking down their fighters," the tactical officer reported. "And they're moving towards a larger Rukpli vessel. Harris and his squadron were doing their job." "Beam incoming," the sensor officer highlighted. A shudder rolled through the UFS Intrepid. Stanley grimaced. The second larger Rukpli vessel had begun to target them. "Fire at the second larger vessel," Stanley ordered. "Firing now," the tactical officer replied. A group of missiles streaked forward towards the second larger Rukpli vessel. Stanley opened a comms link to Harris. "Harris, keep moving your fighter ships closer to their vessels." "Affirmative," Harris said. Another shudder swept through the ship. "Shields are at 80%, the sensor officer announced. They were taking a lot of hits. Stanley didn't know how long his destroyer could take such direct hits. "One of the smaller vessels is breaking up," the sensor officer stated. There was a bright explosion on the view screen as one of the smaller Rukpli vessels exploded into pieces. "One down," his exo said. Chapter 33, Euphra Shipyards, Arcadia. The reaction in the samples caught Peter's eyes, but only for a split second. It had been enough for him to realize that the Rukpli cells had reacted only after Lieutenant Storen had stepped into the room. That, coupled with Storen's prior blank expression when he had mentioned the container, had confirmed Peter's worst fears. The Rukpli was inside Lieutenant Storen. It was an instinctual reaction, but he knew it was the correct one. There had only been a few times in his life when he had felt like this, and today was one of those times. "Everyone take cover," Peter shouted as he pulled out his weapon, spun around and aimed it at Storen. Humphreys froze, unable to comprehend what was going on, but Peters was thankful that Ryan grabbed the older man and pushed him to the ground. Weapons fire erupted in the room as Storen stepped back towards the door. The sound of breaking glass echoed throughout the room. Peters knelt and returned fire, but he was too late. Storen had disappeared from the room. "What's going on?" Humphreys hollered as he hurriedly stood and looked at the samples. Fortunately for Humphreys, none of the glass containers with the Rukpli samples had been destroyed during the exchange of weapons fire. Peters doubted that the Rukpli inside Storen would have wanted to harm the samples. Peters stood. "We had evidence a Rukpli alien had sent a signal from the shipyards. I came here to find it. That was the reason I'm wearing civilian clothes. But the Rukpli alien found me. Somehow when Storen came near the samples, it triggered a reaction. I saw it briefly. That was all I needed to know." Humphreys looked in disbelief. Peters realized the older man was still trying to process the fact that Storen had a Rukpli inside of him. "Secure this room and do not let anyone in, not even me," Peters ordered as he raced to the door. "Affirmative," Ryan replied. Peters slowly opened the door only to encounter more weapons fire. He had thought Storen would have fled the facility, but he hadn't. Peters quickly shut the door. What was Storen up to? And more importantly, how had the Rukpli gotten itself into Storen's body? Peters had observed that Storen had been wearing the Trebium armor, which should have protected him. Peters sent an alert to Titanic Base to send a Marine unit down to Euphra shipyards immediately. Then he knelt, pressed against the door, and opened it an inch or two. This time there was no weapons fire. Peters opened the door further and slipped outside the room. No one was around. He inched himself towards the stairs. It was the only way out of this level of the dome. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he looked up. It was empty. Peters frowned. Storen couldn't have gotten far. Peters opened the comms with UFS Central Command. "This is Captain Peters. Initiate a lockdown of Euphra shipyards immediately. I'm sending over my authorization codes now. Patch me through to the armed guards on site. With a lockdown, Storen would have no chance to leave the facility, unless there was a Rukpli vessel." However, Peters doubted there was any vessel. "Yes, sir," the officer replied. "Patch through now." "This is Captain Peters," Peters announced. "I have initiated a lockdown of the shipyards. Ensure Lieutenant Storen does not leave the premises. He is considered armed and dangerous." "Affirmative," the armed guard replied. Peters switched off his comms link and began to climb the stairs. Every few steps he stopped and listened. Once he reached the top of the stairs, he glanced down the corridor. It was also empty. Where could Storen have gone to? He wasn't sure. Then he heard weapons fire from outside the dome. Peters began racing down the corridor and stopped near the exit. More weapons fire reached his ears. Then there were shouts. Peters slowly opened the door and slipped outside of the dome. Standing several meters ahead of him was Storen, and he held a guard as a hostage. "Captain, I wouldn't come any closer," Storen warned. "Not unless you want to see this soldier's brains splattered on the ground." Chapter 34, Euphra Shipyards, Arcadia. Peters eyed Storen. "You have no place to run. This entire facility has been put under lockdown." He knew he was no longer dealing with Storen. In Peters' mind, Storen was already dead. There was nothing he could do to save Storen. The Rukpli inside Storen scowled. "Do you think your physical limitations mean anything to the Rukpli? We transcend your physical matter." "How did you get into Storen's body?" Peters inquired. It had been bothering him ever since General Williams had informed him of a Rukpli spy amongst the humans in the shipyards. Peters realized that Storen had been targeted. Storen hadn't been randomly selected by the Rukpli aliens. Instead, the Rukpli aliens must have observed the people in the shipyards and discovered that Storen was a senior-ranking person. "A normal Rukpli may not be able to enter a body protected by this armor of yours," the Rukpli inside Storen remarked. "But I am not a normal Rukpli. The seed doesn't have any limitations. We can go anywhere we want. I could jump into your body if I so desired, and you wouldn't be able to stop me, after which you would be dead." The seed? Had Peters heard correctly? Was the seed another arm of the Rukpli? And was that a threat the alien had thrown at him? Peters didn't know, but he took a step back. If this Rukpli alien was able to bypass the Trebium armor, they had a much bigger problem on their hands. Much bigger than the Rukpli being inside Storen. Peters heard the sound of footsteps from his right side. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of several Marines approaching his area. One of them had an emitter in his hands. Would this seed be affected by the emitter? In actuality, they had never tested an emitter on a Rukpli inside a human body. Storen turned and glanced in their direction. "Captain, I would advise you to tell your people to stop." Peters gestured to them, and the group of Marines halted and waited. One of the men carefully placed the emitter on the ground. Peters suspected the emitter had been switched on because he realized it was facing in the direction of Storen. However, Storen didn't seem to be affected by the emitter. Peters had expected it. The emitter was only effective whenever the Rukpli alien was outside of a host body. Storen began to move backwards, dragging the soldier with it. "If you want to see a soldier alive, I wouldn't make any sudden moves." Peters frowned. If Storen got away from here, there would be no way to stop it. Storen could disappear anywhere, and that would become a more complicated problem. He realized what had to be done. It wasn't something he looked forward to, but it had to be done. Peters took up his weapon again and aimed it at Storen. "Captain, I already warned you," Storen started. Peters fired his weapon multiple times. It hit Storen and he went down. The soldier pushed Storen and dove to the side. Chapter 35, Cockpit, UFS Fighter Ship. "There's no end to their fighter ships," Grayson hollered as a fighter ship kept swerving in and out of the incoming enemy ships. A number of Rukpli fighter ships kept coming in waves. Every time she had destroyed a few of the enemy ships, there was no time to enjoy the victory. Another few were waiting for her. "Draw their fire to the larger Rukpli vessel," Harris said. "Affirmative," Grayson said. Grayson fired her weapons, which took out 2 more Rukpli fighter ships. Then she navigated her controls as a fighter ship swooped down below a few more enemy ships that were intensive firing at another one of her squadron mates. "Johnson, watch your rear," Grayson shouted. Johnson was the youngest in the squadron. He, at times, was overconfident, which Grayson felt would be a weakness when they were faced with real enemies. Initially, she had hoped he would not have made the final selection when the squadron was chosen back on Euphra. However, her hopes had been dashed when his name was highlighted amongst those in the squadron. At the time, Johnson had celebrated as if it was his birthday. However, Grayson had warned him to control himself, which had irritated the young man. "I got it," Johnson replied. Johnson's fighter ship engaged the enemy vessel and managed to destroy it. "I told you," Johnson shouted in delight. Grayson sighed. Johnson needed to tone down his confidence and stay alert. They were all heavily outnumbered. "Johnson, more bogies incoming," Harris announced. "I'm coming in to help you," Grayson highlighted. There was no reply from Johnson. His fighter ship continued to veer in and out of the incoming Rukpli fighter ships with its weapons blazing. Grayson steered her vessel right behind 2 more enemy ships that were trying to target Johnson. Then she released a torrent of weapons fire to 2 vessels, taking them out. It was easier than she had expected, but something was wrong. She could sense it. Then her console lit up with multiple bogies racing towards her and Johnson from both sides. It had been a trap. "Johnson, steer away," Grayson yelled as she pulled up hard on her navigation controls. "It's a trap." The 2 Rukpli vessels which had been following Johnson had been the intended sacrifice, and she had walked right into their trap and destroyed them. She sighed. Her fighter ship quickly ascended. She heard an explosion close by her and saw the light from Johnson's fighter ship explode. Johnson, Grayson's voice trailed off. No one else in the squadron spoke. There was no need to say anything. Johnson was dead. Grayson didn't know how many of their squadron would remain alive before this battle was over. Johnson should have listened to her, but he hadn't and had paid with his life. "Everyone fall back from the larger vessel and regroup now," Harris ordered. Chapter 36, Bridge, UFS Intrepid. "Harris' squadron is breaking up," Mendez reported. "I think they are suffering casualties." Stanley had anticipated that outcome. Although Harris's squadron had taken down many Rukpli fighter ships, there were simply too many of them. They kept coming in multiple waves. He also couldn't understand how the larger Rukpli vessel had the capacity to contain so many fighter ships. "Captain, the larger Rukpli vessel is experiencing explosions," the tactical officer announced. Stanley turned his attention to that Rukpli vessel. It began to break up as multiple explosions consumed it. Then a large bright light followed as the vessel disintegrated into a large debris field. The explosion took out many of the Rukpli fighter ships with it. The tactical officer raised his fist. However, it wasn't over yet. They still had 2 more Rukpli vessels to deal with. "The other 2 Rukpli vessels have disappeared," the sensor officer reported. There was a collective sigh of relief throughout his bridge. Stanley didn't want to show it, but he was also relieved. "Are you able to detect where the 2 ships disappeared to?" Stanley asked. "Negative, sir," the sensor officer replied. Again, the Rukpli had been able to disappear whenever they wanted. Stanley suspected it had to do with their ability to travel at high speeds. Despite that, he was also glad the remaining Rukpli vessels had decided to withdraw. His crew and that of the UFS Winston needed a break to regroup. Stanley turned to his XO. "Do a check of the entire vessel. Determine if we suffered any breaches or if there was any other suspicious activity. While you're at it, scan the entire ship for possible distortions too." "Aye, Captain," Mendez replied. The remainder of the squadron is returning to the hangar bay. Although their shields had held, Stanley wasn't taking a chance with the Rukpli. He opened a comms link to Captain Ronald. "What's your status?" "Our ship's shields are at 60%, Ronald replied. "We didn't have any breaches." Stanley was relieved that Ronald had managed to keep his destroyer intact. "Do a scan for any distortions on board and check for any other suspicious activity," Stanley ordered. Ronald hesitated. "They wouldn't be able to get past our shields, right?" "We cannot make that assumption with the Rukpli," Stanley said. "Do the scans." "Affirmative," Ronald highlighted. Ronald didn't have the experience that Stanley and his crew had when a Rukpli alien had snuck on board their vessel under the guise of a human. Stanley still didn't know the extent of the capabilities of the Rukpli. Could the Rukpli have found alternative ways to sneak on board? Nothing was off the table with the Rukpli aliens. Stanley ended the comms with Ronald and turned to his exo. "Once the checks come back negative, set a course back to the source of the transmission." "What are you thinking, sir?" his exo asked. "I think this attack by the Rukpli was staged to slow us down," Stanley commented. "The Rukpli don't want us to find whatever is at the position of that secret transmission. We need to move quickly." Chapter 37, Euphra Council, Arcadia. General Williams sat at the chair on one end of a large circular table. Across the table sat the 6 members of the Euphra Council, who represented the different parts of the society on Euphra. Sheldon sat beside him. Admiral Sheldon had been concerned when Williams informed him of the new proposal. It was startling and a reality check of the situation. Williams had to admit he would have never considered the proposal unless he saw a need for it. Eventually, Sheldon had agreed to it, knowing full well the ability of the UFS destroyers to fend off a full-scale attack may be limited. Council member Darius looked at him. "General, to be frank, none of us here expected this proposal from your side." Darius was the head of the Euphra Council that governed Euphra. He was a popular figure amongst the civilian population and the longest-serving member of the council. "I understand," Williams said. He realized his proposal to begin moving the civilian population away from Euphra was a drastic one. To anyone hearing it for the first time, it would sound like a defeatist approach. "Before I submitted this proposal to the council, I also discussed it with General Myers," Williams added. "And what was his reaction?" Darius asked. "Myers said it sounded like we were scared and running away from fighting the enemy," Williams replied. Darius laughed. "That sounds just like something Myers would say." There were nods around the table. Williams remained emotionless. He knew his predecessor was well respected by the Euphra Council, and who wouldn't be? But now Williams had to face the council on his own merit. Darius turned to Sheldon. "Admiral, is there anything you'd like to add?" "While I do agree with Myers, we need to look for practical solutions to save the colony," Sheldon said. "I never thought running away like a coward would be one of those practical options," Darius countered. Williams realized he was facing an uphill battle with the council. It seemed like Darius didn't favor such a withdrawal from Euphra. "Your proposal doesn't indicate a destination for those who participate in this exodus," Crystal said. "Or did I miss that part?" Crystal was the second highest ranking member of the Euphra Council. For a short while, she had served under General Myers and was well versed with the Euphra Defense Forces. Williams had hoped she would understand his perspective. Williams nudged Sheldon. "We have identified several uninhabited planets outside of the Vonia system," Sheldon announced. "They are habitable and provide a reasonable climate for us to restart again." "And what if the Rukpli aliens pursue us over there?" Darius asked. "There's no evidence to suggest such a scenario would unfold," Williams said. "The Rukpli aliens are fixated on this planet and the Trebium." "This is what they told you," Darius said. "But we don't have any further information beyond that about this alien species." "What about the Rukpli alien you captured? Have you been able to extract anything out of it?" Williams had been expecting that question ever since he had set foot into the space. Colonel Rames had failed in his first few attempts to interrogate the Rukpli alien. Williams had been frustrated with Rames. He had expected results in sending in Rames. Despite that, Williams insisted Rames continue to try to find a way to talk to it. "We're still working on it," Williams replied. "I think you need to work harder," Darius commented. Williams tried his best to ignore the sarcasm behind his tone. It took another hour before Williams stepped out of the room with Sheldon beside him. Sitting in that space had been worse than all of his battles combined. Williams didn't understand how Myers was able to work with the Euphra Council so effectively. It was something he would need to learn and master. "That took much longer than I had expected," Sheldon remarked. "Of course," Williams scoffed, "but I'm glad the Euphra Council was able to approve the proposal after all the discussion and questions." "I'm not sure we left them in any choice," Sheldon said. Williams realized that the hardest part was still ahead. They would need to convince the civilian population for the need to participate in the exodus. Chapter 38, Euphra Shipyards, Arcadia. Storen's body fell back, but it disintegrated before it even touched the ground. Peters didn't see any Rukpli alien presence leave the body. "Everyone, stand back," Peters shouted. "Keep the emitter switched on." Where was the Rukpli alien? It had obviously left Storen's body. Peters squinted his eyes, but couldn't discern anything. The emitter was the only thing they could use against the Rukpli alien. However, he wasn't sure this particular type of Rukpli alien could be stopped by the emitter. One of the men pointed to some shrubs further along a path. "The alien's over there." Peters turned his gaze in that direction. He detected the subtle but coordinated movement of the leaves as the Rukpli alien moved away from them. The Marine with the emitter didn't wait. He picked it up and moved forward down the path. The emitter seemed to also have an effect on this particular kind of Rukpli. Peters followed the Marines as they slowly tracked the Rukpli alien. Then, one of his men cried out and raised his hands. Peters gritted his teeth. The Rukpli alien had jumped into the man's body. How was it possible? Why did this Rukpli have such an ability? Why wasn't it hindered by the Trebium armor? The rest of the Marines stepped away from the man, who staggered backwards and raced away. Peters had no intention of shooting another unarmed human. He had already done enough by firing his weapon at Storen. "Follow him and take him down," Peters shouted. With the Rukpli alien's ability to jump at will into any host, Peters didn't know what they could do. This Rukpli alien could continue jumping from body to body with no end, leaving behind a trail of dead bodies. "Captain, I have an idea," a voice said from behind him. Peters turned. It was Humphreys and Ryan. What were they doing out here? How long had they been standing there? The last thing Peters wanted was for the Rukpli alien to kill Humphreys. "You both shouldn't be out here," Peters warned. "This Rukpli is able to jump into any human body. I told you to stay inside." "I have a way to detect its presence inside a host body," Humphreys announced. Chapter 39. Bridge, UFS Intrepid. Stanley glanced at the report his XO had submitted on the status of his destroyer. There had been no unusual activities that had been discovered after their engagement with the Rukpli vessels. Captain Ronald had also reported that there had been no anomalies on the UFS Winston. Stanley was wary of the reports, but hoped that was really the case. Despite that, he had requested his XO and Ronald to continue to run distortion scans every 30 minutes. "Sir, my teams checked on the weapons and the shields," his XO said. "No issues were found. Our shields are back at 100%. We did some calibration on the mag rail guns. Hopefully, their accuracy will improve in our next engagement with the Rukpli." "Captain, we are coming up on the position," the sensor officer reported. Stanley returned his attention to the view screen. A reddish planet appeared on the center of the view screen. "Is the position within the planet?" Stanley asked. "Affirmative," the sensor officer replied. "Is this what the Rukpli were protecting?" his XO asked. Stanley nodded. "I believe so. Hold our position here, and inform the UFS Winston to do likewise." "I've informed Captain Ronald," Mendez remarked. "Can we do a scan of the planet?" Stanley asked. "Long-range scans don't detect anything of significance," the sensor officer replied. "Once we get into orbit, our scans will be able to get more information." Stanley was against the idea of getting too close to that planet. He didn't know if the Rukpli were lying waiting for them. "Send in a drone," Stanley ordered. "Drone launched," the sensor officer said. "Do you think it's their home planet?" Mendez asked as they waited for the drone to reach the planet. Stanley shook his head. "The drone just entered the atmosphere," the sensor officer reported. "What are the readings of the drone?" Stanley inquired. "The readings identify possible life signs on the planet," the sensor officer commented. "I'm getting the first images now." The view screen flickered and the first images began to appear. "Are those structures?" Mendez asked. "It appears so," the sensor officer replied. Then the images disappeared off the view screen. "What happened?" Mendez inquired. "Did we lose the signal?" "The drone's offline," the sensor officer said. "I'm unable to retrieve anything from it." "Did it crash into the surface?" Stanley asked. "Unable to confirm that," the sensor officer replied. "It must have been shot down," the tactical officer remarked. Stanley had been having the same thought. If the drone had been shot down, it meant there was someone still down there on the planet. He guessed it had to be more Rukpli aliens. They would need to proceed cautiously. "It's possible their defense system shot down the drone," his XO suggested. Now that they had some evidence of life signs on the planet, they couldn't do much staying away from it. They had to get closer to find out what exactly was going on. If the Rukpli was still there, he needed to know. None of this still answered the question as to who had sent a secret transmission to them. "Take us into orbit," Stanley ordered. "Inform the UFS Winston to hold position here." "Affirmative," the navigation officer replied. He didn't want to take both destroyers into orbit. If this was a trap, the UFS Winston would still have a chance to return to Euphra. Chapter 40. Euphra Shipyards, Arcadia. Peters was seated in the room with Humphreys and Ryan. He had sent his men to search the entire facility. There had been no further sightings of the Rukpli alien. Neither of the men had asked him why he had shot Lieutenant Storen. Peters assumed they had witnessed him discharge his weapon on Storen. At the point of firing, Storen's face had reverted to that of the lieutenant. The desperation in his eyes had been evident. Storen knew his life was coming to an end, and Peters hadn't been able to help him. Peters realized that the Rukpli inside Storen had purposely wanted him to see the real Storen one last time. Peters pushed those thoughts away and glanced at Humphreys. Do you want to explain how we can track the alien within a human? I've been able to modify the settings on Ryan's device here to scan for any communication signal within a human, Humphrey said. Peters was skeptical. But how will we be sure that the signal is related to the Rukpli cells? I mean, it could be signals from any number of other phenomena in the air. Humphrey smiled. I had considered that possibility. To counter such signal interference, I modified Ryan's device. It now solely focuses on a signal that is unique to the Rukpli cells. His device won't be able to pick up other random signals. But we still need to test it out, right? Peters asked. Of course, Humphreys grinned. I'm a man of science. I need to prove it. Peters had to credit the chief scientist. His discovery of using an emitter had been a game changer for them in dealing with the Rukpli aliens. He was sure this would be another game changer, but he needed to see it in action first to believe it. But will your device also work on the special Rukpli seed we encountered? Peters asked. I'm unable to confirm that until we find it, Humphrey said. An hour later, Ryan had assembled the first batch of men and women to be tested using a new device. Peters had suggested they run a test on all the personnel assigned to the facility, starting with those from the Euphra Defense Forces. Then Ryan had gone through the first batch. Nothing had been detected. Following that, the next batches were brought in outside the dome. All the people obeyed without question. Ryan again repeated the same steps. Nothing. Peters remained patient. This was the least they could do. If none of the personnel in the facility showed any signs of the Rukpli alien, they were safe, at least for now. An hour later, Ryan walked back towards him. Captain, they're all clear. That was what Peters had been worried about. The Rukpli alien had left the shipyards. By now, it could be anywhere in Arcadia. There was no easy way for them to scan the city. Even if Ryan went on a transport with his device, it would take days to cover every inch of the city. Peters turned to Ryan. You know what that means, right? Yes, sir. The Rukpli alien has escaped. Chapter 41, Hangar Bay, UFS Intrepid. Stanley stood near the shuttle and waited for his crew while they checked the vessel. The UFS Intrepid had reached orbit without any incident. No Rukpli vessels had appeared and tried to stop them. Stanley found that part a bit strange. His gut instinct told him that the Rukpli vessels were around somewhere. They also hadn't sent down any more drones to the planet's surface. Instead, Stanley had decided on an alternative plan. Commander Mendez had vehemently objected to it. Stanley understood his XO's concern, but in the end it was his decision as captain and he would take responsibility for it. Harris seemed to share his XO's concerns. Captain, are you sure about this? Yes, it's the only way, Stanley replied. And before you say anything further, let me say that my XO disagreed with the plan and has tried its best to talk me out of it. However, we will still proceed with my plan. Harris nodded reluctantly. His plan centered on taking the shuttle and a few fighter ships from Harris's squadron down to the planet's surface. The fighter ships would provide cover for the shuttle in case they ran into any enemy vessels. Stanley had to admit there was a certain risk to his plan. However, that risk was nothing compared to his need to find out the source of the secret transmission. They had traveled all this way to find this source. They couldn't afford to wait in orbit. Time was running out for Euphra. The Rukpli fleet could invade Euphra at any moment. If there was something here that could help them, he needed to find it. As a last resort, his XO had volunteered to go down instead of him, but Stanley had denied that option. He needed to do this. He was the reason the two destroyers were out here trying to find out more information on the Rukpli aliens. After the shuttle lands on the surface, I will need your pilots to provide cover, Stanley commented. We do not know what we are facing down there. We'll do what is necessary, Harris said. But if I say you need to leave, I will insist you return to the shuttle and get off the planet. Agreed, Stanley said. How's your squadron? We took a few losses, but other than that, they should be okay, Harris remarked. The Rukpli fighter ships seem to be able to change their strategies quite frequently during combat. I suspect they had someone coordinating everything from that larger Rukpli vessel. At one point, some of the Rukpli fighter ships became a sacrifice for others to target us. Stanley found Harris's comments interesting. Were the Rukpli fighter ships acting as a collective? If that was the case, Stanley realized there was so much more to uncover about this alien species. What can we expect down there? Harris inquired. Our scans from the drone detected a small city on the western side of the planet, Stanley replied. That city has been confirmed to be the source from which someone sent a secret transmission. Harris's eyes widened. Is it a Rukpli city? We won't know until we get down there, Stanley replied. Someone is down there because our drone was shot down. I'll update my pilots on it, Harris said, and moved away to talk to a group of men and women standing at one corner of the hangar bay. Mendes walked up to him. Captain, I still don't like this plan. This is crazy and suicidal. Stanley struggled to control his frustration with his XO. Your objections have been noted. Mendes lowered his voice. I was assigned to this post because of my experience and to provide you with guidance. I don't feel you're taking any guidance from me. You may be experienced, but I am the captain, Stanley insisted. This is my call. Admiral Harris and many people died, Mendes pleaded. I don't want to add you to that growing list. Stanley glared at him. I'm aware that many good people died because of the Rukpli, but we need to strike back at them without waiting for the next wave. Harris wouldn't approve of this reckless action, Mendes countered. Stanley clenched his fist, turned and walked into the shuttle. Chapter 42, Euphra Shipyards, Arcadia. The update to General Williams and Admiral Sheldon hadn't gone as expected. Peters didn't know why Williams had brought in Sheldon to the meeting. As expected, Sheldon had been livid when he was told that an undercover mission had been conducted without his consent. However, his face had turned pale once he heard of the Rukpli inside Lieutenant Storen and the fact that Storen was now dead. From that point onwards, Sheldon had kept quiet. Peters suspected Sheldon had informed Storen about the Rukpli spy before he had arrived at the shipyard. He had no way to prove it, but if Sheldon had done it, Peters realized they had gotten lucky that Storen hadn't done serious damage or fled the facility before he had arrived. We still don't know if Humphrey's latest innovation actually works, Williams muttered. Williams didn't try to hide his frustration with everything going on. The general had been unhappy that the Rukpli alien seed had gotten away. No, sir, Peters replied. This particular Rukpli called itself the seed, Williams remarked. What does that mean? I'm not sure, Peters said, but I think it's a different type of Rukpli. It didn't seem to fear the Trebium armor at all. Sheldon lifted his hands in dismay. If the Trebium armor cannot stop it, then what can? Peters remained silent. He also didn't have an answer to it. The thought of a Rukpli alien wandering freely around Arcadia was disturbing, and they had no way to stop it. I need to leave as I have to find someone to take over Storen, Sheldon mumbled and left the holoscreen. Williams turned to Peters. Do you think Sheldon spoke to Storen before you reached the facility? Peters had hoped that Williams hadn't picked up on it from Sheldon's facial expression. I'm not sure, Peters replied calmly. He didn't want to get into whatever was going on between Williams and Sheldon. They didn't have time for such a drama. Williams seemed satisfied with that response. Check on the status of the alien vessel and update me. Hopefully there's something there we can use against the Rukpli aliens. Affirmative, Peters said as the holoscreen went blank. A few minutes later, Peters walked towards the next dome. Humphreys and Ryan had gone back into the first dome to further work on their experiments. Peters had stationed several guards, with one of them holding onto Ryan's device outside the first dome. At least the device would prevent the Rukpli alien seed from entering into the first dome. Assuming, of course, the device worked. He had requested Ryan to help modify several more devices as soon as possible. Peters stopped at the entrance to the next dome. 2 armed guards saluted him, and he stepped inside the dome. He strode down a corridor and took the stairs to the lower level. On his right was a door. He opened it and slipped inside. He found himself standing in a space that was half the size of a hangar bay structure. The space was mostly empty, except for the center area. The bright lights shone on the alien vessel. The vessel itself and its parts were strewn across half the floor of the space. There were 10 armed guards standing around the perimeter of the space. Within the perimeter, 4 engineers were bent down and examining the parts of the alien vessel. Peters walked closer until one of the engineers recognized him, stood, and approached him. What's the status? Peters asked, as his eyes swept the different unknown parts on the floor. We have been able to strip down the entire alien vessel into its parts, the engineer said, and we have also catalogued everything. Were you able to find anything useful? Peters inquired. The engineer nodded. Yes, we found out how the Rukpli aliens achieve very fast travel speeds. We managed to deconstruct their drive and create a blueprint of it. The technology is amazing, but we should be able to replicate it. I'll get my engineers to start working on it. We should be able to build a faster-than-light drive soon for our own vessels. The excitement behind the engineer's voice was unmistakable. Peters smiled. After their failure to find the missing Rukpli alien, he was glad to hear some good news. This information would please General Williams and Admiral Sheldon. Although Peters didn't know much about the travel abilities of the UFS vessels, he realized this could be a breakthrough for the UFS and humanity. Chapter 43, Unknown Planet, Vonia System. Stanley was seated inside the shuttle as it descended through the atmosphere of the reddish planet. He was still fuming with his XO. How dare he bring up Admiral Harris and his intentions? Stanley had wanted to send a transmission to his XO, but he realized this was the worst time to get distracted. He needed to keep his attention on the mission ahead. He glanced through the view screen. One of the fighter ships from Harris's squadron was ahead of the shuttle. Stanley expected the rest of them were surrounding his shuttle. Anyone looking up into the sky would see a convoy of vessels approaching the surface. This would be his first time setting foot on another planet. "Captain, we are approaching the outskirts of the city," the pilot announced. During their descent, sensor readings had indicated that the atmosphere was breathable. That had taken off the burden of wearing the suits. Stanley had ordered the pilot to land the shuttle away from the center of the city. Since they had no idea what they were walking into, it was best to approach slowly from the city's perimeter. The pilot hadn't been able to detect anything during the descent to the city. Stanley found it strange and suspected their sensors were being jammed. A few minutes later, the sound of the shuttle landing invaded his ears. None of the vessels in the convoy had encountered any weapons fire, which was disturbing. Stanley stepped out of the shuttle. The air was hotter than he had expected. 5 officers were with him, which included Dalton. All of them were equipped with the Trebium armor and the Magwell assault weapon. He had specifically requested Dalton to join the team, as Stanley knew the young officer had more experience than the rest against the Rukpli aliens. "Dalton, how far is the center from here?" Stanley asked. "About 10 minutes, sir," Dalton replied. In the distance, several structures rose from the surface. While in the shuttle, Stanley had caught a glimpse of the entire city. He estimated it was probably a quarter the size of Arcadia. Despite that, the city seemed big. "Turn on your heads-up display," Stanley ordered as he switched his one on. "Keep your eyes open for any movement." The heads-up display turned on and began displaying a series of data. He wasn't surprised to see the higher temperature readings. It was hotter here than Arcadia. The video footage was being relayed back towards the bridge on the UFS Intrepid. Mendez hadn't said a word ever since the shuttle had departed from the hangar bay. Stanley found it better that his XO didn't say anything further. It was the first time Stanley had seen Mendez so dead set against something. It had taken Stanley by surprise, but as captain, he had overridden his XO's concerns. Stanley could imagine the thoughts going through his XO's head, but he brushed them aside as he looked at the structures. Stanley pointed ahead. "Dalton, lead the way." Dalton nodded and they began to follow him in a single-file formation towards the city. Stanley kept his weapon leveled in front of him. As they continued to march forward, he realized the structures ahead of them looked old, much older than those on Euphra. Whoever had built this city had done it a long time ago. Although they were walking in the open, Harris's fighter ships were hovering above them, keeping a close eye on the area. "Harris, how is everything up there?" Stanley asked. "Captain, everything's quiet," Harris said. "Our scans haven't detected anything yet." It was a bit too quiet. Stanley didn't like it. A sense of uneasiness began to creep up all over him. Something had shot down their drone. Why wasn't that something engaging with them? Was there something waiting for them? Were they walking into a trap? It was too late to change course. "Take cover," Harris shouted. "Incoming on your left." Chapter 44. Bridge, UFS Intrepid. "Commander, the team on the ground has encountered weapons fire," the sensor officer reported. Mendez gritted his teeth. This was why he had been against Captain Stanley heading down to the surface of an unknown planet. They had no clue what was down there, and the negative scan readings had only made his case stronger. Why hadn't Stanley listened to him? Mendez had tried his best to convince the captain, but his captain had been stubborn, and in his opinion a bit reckless. Mendez had never had to deal with such a captain in his previous postings on UFS vessels. "Are we able to identify the attackers?" Mendez asked. "There are multiple life signs appearing in the city," the sensor officer said. "I'm very sure there were none earlier." "Wait, they're gone now." Mendez grimaced. Whoever was down there must have been jamming their sensors. It was too late to debate all of that. Mendez hoped that Harris and his fighter ships could provide the necessary cover for the captain and his team. "Sir, we have a vessel on an intercept course with us," the sensor officer replied. Where had that vessel emerged from? He suspected it was a Rukpli vessel. He recalled how Captain Stanley had suspected that the Rukpli vessel seemed to have something like a faster-than-light technology when it came to traveling across the galaxy. Was this the reason behind their ability to appear and disappear at will? "Break orbit now," Mendez ordered. He also found it suspicious that the appearance of the alien vessel happened at the same time as the weapons fire down on the planet. "Affirmative," the navigation officer said. "Prepare to engage," Mendez directed. "The vessel will be in weapons range in 1 minute," the tactical officer highlighted. The vessel was approaching them rapidly. It must have been hiding on the far side of this planet. Mendez was upset their scans hadn't detected its presence until it was too late. "Bring it up on the screen," Mendez said. The vessel appeared on the view screen. The shape of the vessel confirmed that it belonged to the Rukpli. "Do you want to hail them?" the comms officer asked. Mendez shook his head. "Fire when they're in weapons range." He wasn't going to take any chances with the Rukpli aliens, not after their last encounter. There was also no need to try and communicate with the Rukpli. "Captain, I think this was the other smaller vessel from our last engagement," the sensor officer stated. "Fire the missiles," Mendez said. "Firing," the tactical officer announced. The contrails of the missiles streaked ahead towards the smaller Rukpli vessel. The Rukpli vessel began to take evasive actions. "They're firing at us," the tactical officer shouted. Chapter 45. Unknown Planet, Vonia System. Stanley leaped to the right. The explosion shook the ground as his body was thrown further away. Stanley shook his head. Pain shot through his body. The ringing from the explosion was still in his ears. He slowly lifted his head and looked around. There was a small crater at his previous position. Debris was flying all over the crater. "Take them out," Stanley whispered as he tried to get up. "Affirmative," Harris said. Stanley felt a sharp pain on his head. His vision was still a bit blurred as he stood and looked for his crew. "Captain, I'm here," Dalton shouted. Stanley turned to his left and was relieved to see that all his crew had survived the attack. But they didn't have time to wait. They were still in the open and vulnerable. At any moment, enemy fire could easily take them out. Dalton gestured at a small structure to their right. "This way, sir." The structure was about 200 meters away from their current position. Stanley began racing behind his crew as they approached the structure. His heart was thumping. The ringing in his ears had subsided. His vision became clearer as they neared the smaller structure. Two more explosions erupted several meters behind them. The heat from the explosions tickled his skin. Once they reached the back wall of the structure, he realized it looked like a 3-level building. Stanley was breathing hard. "Anyone have their sights on the position of the weapons fire?" "Negative, sir," Dalton replied as he peeked around the corner of the structure. "But we cannot stay behind here for too long." Dalton was right. The young officer was calm. His previous experience with the Rukpli aliens on Euphra had helped strengthen his capabilities. However, the rest of the crew looked to be in a state of shock. They probably had never before encountered a near-death experience. Stanley switched to his comms with Harris. "Can you give us a position on where the weapons fire came from?" "It's coming from a tower that is about half a click from your current position," Harris reported. It is also targeting our ships, so we are unable to provide cover for you." "Can you take the tower out?" Stanley asked. "That's the plan," Harris replied. Chapter 46. Cockpit, UFS Fighter Ship. It had only been a minute since everything had gone to hell. Lieutenant Grayson peered through her cockpit view screen. She had been navigating alongside Harris's fighter ship when she had spotted the weapons fire. It had emerged without any warning from a tower-like structure that made her suspect it was an automated artillery battery. Further scans had confirmed it. The artillery battery had first targeted Captain Stanley and his crew. However, then it had begun targeting the fighter ships. Grayson had managed to pull back on the navigational controls just in time to avoid the incoming weapons fire. Harris had accompanied her fighter ship as they had both veered off. "Grayson, I need you to take out that tower while I try to provide cover for Stanley and his crew," Harris ordered. "I asked the rest to fall back and monitor for any incoming vessels." "Affirmative," Grayson said as she pushed her navigation controls forward. Her fighter ship began to descend as it turned around for a pass over the city. "Incoming fire on your aft side," Harris shouted. Grayson banked her fighter ship to evade the weapons fire. Where had that come from? Was it another tower? She couldn't tell. "It's another artillery battery from a tower on the other end of the city," Harris said. "I'll take that one out." Harris's fighter ship banked to the left and veered away from her vessel. She was on her own. Harris had faith in her ability to take out the tower that was targeting Stanley and his crew. Grayson wasn't going to let Harris down. This was her chance to show how capable she really was. Even during her training back on Euphra, Grayson had always strived to improve herself. She always sensed there was more she could do, more she could achieve. That had motivated her to never stop pushing. At times, this had resulted in some animosity amongst her squadron mates, but it didn't matter then, and it didn't matter now. One day she hoped to lead her own squadron like Harris. Her thoughts were broken by an alert on her view screen. Weapons fire was emerging from a third location. How many artillery batteries were placed around this small city? And why were they being activated in a staggered manner? Grayson suspected that whoever had created these weapon systems had programmed them intentionally to follow a staggered activation approach. She had to admit that it was a smart thing to do because it forced all of them to stay alert. Added to that was the fact that these artillery batteries were well camouflaged. None of her cockpit sensors were able to detect these artillery batteries until the very last moment. "Captain Stanley, I need you to distract the tower artillery battery," Grayson said. "Affirmative," Stanley replied. A few moments later, her cockpit sensors picked up the first tower artillery battery, turning towards the smaller structure. Grayson only had a few seconds to react. She brought her target in line with the tower and unleashed a barrage of gunfire. The gunfire found its mark perfectly, blowing up the entire tower, which then collapsed on itself into a heap of rubble on the ground. A large amount of dust shot up into the air around the area in which the tower had stood. Grayson lifted her right fist in victory, one tower down. The rest of the towers would join the heap of rubble soon enough. "Nice takedown," Harris said. "Thank you," Grayson started. She was interrupted when her fighter ship jerked to the left and the right. Grayson examined the sensors. Her ship had taken a hit. She couldn't tell where the weapon's fire had come from. Smoke was coming from her tail. "I'm hit," Grayson shouted. There was no reply from Harris. She didn't know if his fighter ship had also been hit. She grabbed the navigational controls as she tried to straighten her vessel. The fighter ship began to spin and sway out of control as it descended towards the surface. Her controls were beeping different sounds. She realized there was no way to bring the fighter ship down in one piece. She clicked on the ejection button. A second later, she was ejected out of the chair and she was in a free fall. The surface was approaching her rapidly. Then she felt a hard pull back as her parachute opened, slowing her fall. Grayson glanced below her feet as she glided down to the surface. She realized she was going to land in the northern section of the city. She braced as her feet touched the surface. She rolled onto the ground and came to a stop. She was inside the city. Chapter 47, Deck 2, UFS Winston. The room was mostly empty except for a series of tall items which it didn't understand. The Rukpli seed had hidden itself behind the items ever since it had made the telejump onto this human vessel. The telejump had been simple. It had been informed that the exterior of this human vessel was lined with a mineral that made it impossible for a typical Rukpli to telejump through. However, for the Rukpli seed, there were no such constraints. It could move through anything. The Rukpli seed had been honored that it had been chosen for this mission. Back on the Rukpli homeworld, it would have endured a prolonged series of training and tests to prove to the Rukpli supreme leader that it was worthy to join the ranks of the Rukpli seed. Many aspired to join such ranks, but few actually made it through. The Rukpli supreme leader had commissioned its mission to infiltrate the human vessel and disrupt their plans. There was a sound. The Rukpli seed turned its attention to the door to the room. It staggered backwards and remained quiet. Someone was about to enter the room. The door slid open and two humans stepped inside. The Rukpli seed found the human species disgusting. They reeked of different smells that it couldn't tolerate. It didn't know how its Rukpli comrade, who had body jumped into a human, had survived. In time to come, it realized it would need to do the same, but not yet. "Is it in here?" the first human asked. "Let me take a look," the second human replied. The second human moved closer to the items behind which the Rukpli seed was hiding. It wasn't sure the humans would detect its presence. The Rukpli seed felt that outcome was unlikely. The human species were too complacent. Compared to many other species they had fought with, the humans seemed to be of no threat to them. Yet, the Rukpli seed found it unusual that it had been deployed to attack the humans. Such a weak species didn't warrant the activation of the Rukpli seed. It was well known that the seed was only used in situations that were dire and needed drastic interventions. But the Supreme Leader must have sensed the danger with the human species. It would follow the Rukpli Supreme Leader's instruction. Even now it could sense the Rukpli Supreme Leader's presence. No one among the Rukpli knew how the Supreme Leader was able to reach out to every Rukpli wherever they were in the galaxy. It was a mystery that spanned generations. However, it didn't dare interact with the Rukpli Supreme Leader. When the time was right, the Rukpli Supreme Leader would speak. For a second, it appeared as if the second human was looking straight at it. But then, the second human turned back to face the first human. "I thought it was here, but I guess I was wrong," the second human remarked. "Let's go and check the next storeroom. It has to be on this deck." Then the two humans left the room. The Rukpli seed relaxed. It had doubted that the humans would have been able to detect it. No one would suspect its presence on board this vessel. At the right time, it would complete its mission. Chapter 48, Admiral's Office, UFS Central Command. Sheldon swiped open a holoscreen. He had been trying to avoid General Williams for the last few hours. He didn't want to talk to him. Finding out that Williams had sent Peters behind his back into the shipyards had rattled him. In actuality, rattle was too nice a word. Sheldon felt an uneasiness creep into his heart as Williams' face emerged. In the past, Sheldon knew that General Myers was never fond of him, but Myers would never have pulled such a stunt. It was disrespectful. For Williams to do such a thing, it meant he had no respect for him. "Sheldon, I got news," Williams said. "Your engineers have been able to replicate the Rukpli faster-than-light technology." Sheldon nodded. His head engineer at the shipyards had updated him a little while ago. He struggled to control himself knowing that information was being sent to Euphra Defense Forces without his consent. He didn't like being bypassed. "I'm sure you're aware of it too," Williams remarked, "but I was impressed by the speed of your engineers. I thought it might take weeks or even months." "I had deployed my best engineers on it," Sheldon admitted. In fact, he had redeployed UFS's brightest engineers to the project. Most of them had been excited to work on developing the prototype drive. Sheldon hadn't seen it yet, but he had ordered the engineers to start testing it out on an unmanned smaller vessel. "This will help expedite the exodus of our population," Williams said. The general was pleased. Sheldon projected a fake smile. All the hard work had been done by his engineers, but it wasn't completed. They would need to have extensive tests to ensure it was safe. This new prototype drive had become the highest priority, even more than the building of the destroyers. I'll update the Euphra Council on the possibility, Williams continued. Sheldon tried to calm Williams' enthusiasm. I think we should wait until we have definite results from the tests. This drive is brand new for us. The last thing he wanted was for the civilian government to put pressure on the UFS to get successful test results. And if anything was to fail with the prototype drive, Sheldon knew he would be blamed for it. He wasn't going to let that happen, not on his watch. Williams frowned. Okay, but we need to move quickly. Sheldon clenched his fist but remained emotionless. Working with Williams was becoming a problem. He was too aggressive. His behavior reminded him of General Myers. Any news from Stanley? Williams asked. He's due to submit his next report in a few hours, Sheldon replied. I'll forward it to you then. By now, they should be at the source of the transmission. Stanley's previous report had detailed their engagement with 4 Rukpli vessels. Sheldon had been impressed that Stanley had been able to destroy 2 of the vessels without conceding much losses on their end. He couldn't wait for his next report. It would give a clearer picture of who had sent that secret transmission. Although he wouldn't say it out loud, Sheldon was betting that there was someone out there at the fringe of the Vonia system who could be a potential ally to them in their fight against the Rukpli. Have you been able to extract anything from the captured Rukpli? Sheldon asked. Williams shook his head in dismay. Sheldon guessed Colonel Ramirez had failed. I'm going to get Peters to take a shot at interrogating the Rukpli alien, Williams remarked. Sheldon raised his eyebrows. Chapter 49, Unknown Planet, Vonia System. After the collapse of the tower with the artillery battery, Stanley had ordered his crew to run forward. They emerged from behind the smaller structure and raced towards the nearest entry point to the city. Stanley looked around as they darted forward. There were no signs of Harris or any of his squadron's fighter ships. What had happened to them? He didn't know. He had also warned all of his crew not to use the comms. There was no way to know if anyone was listening in on them as they approached the center of the city. He also didn't dare communicate with his XO on the UFS Intrepid, at least not until they discovered what was really going on in this city. As Stanley and his crew reached the gantry into the city, he ducked down in case of any weapons fire, but there was nothing. Silence greeted them after the tower with the artillery battery had collapsed. They raced through the gantry and stopped beside the structure. Dalton turned to him. Captain, where do we go from here? Stanley glanced around. They were standing next to a taller structure. There was a pathway going forward. It most likely would lead them to the center of the city. During their descent, Stanley recalled that a dome-shaped building had occupied the city center. That would be a good place as any to start from. Stanley pointed ahead. Let's follow down this path. An uneasiness had wrapped itself around him. He didn't like it. This city couldn't be empty. That didn't make sense. The presence of the artillery batteries implied the city had been occupied. If so, where were its inhabitants? Dalton nodded as they slowly marched forward. Anyone detecting any life signs? Stanley asked. All of his crew replied they didn't detect anyone. Stanley doubted their devices' readings. Just like something had jammed their vessels from detecting the artillery batteries, their devices were being jammed. Dalton stopped. Captain, Stanley looked ahead. There was a clearing. At the center was the dome-shaped building he had caught a glimpse of during their descent. The dome-shaped building looked as old as the rest of the structures. There were several trees surrounding the dome-shaped building. However, the area was still empty. He opened a comms link to Harris, only to realize he couldn't send any communication. Is anyone able to send a comms link back to the shuttle? Stanley asked. Everyone shook their heads. Dalton exchanged glances with him. The junior officer also sensed the danger they were in, but they couldn't turn back and leave. The secret transmission had been sent from this city. They had come all this way to the fringe of the Vonia system to uncover it. Dalton must have sensed his dilemma. I think we should explore that dome. There might be some evidence inside of who sent the transmission. Lead the way, Stanley said. Chapter 50, Bridge, UFS Intrepid. Mendez felt a shudder roll through the destroyer. Take evasive actions now. Affirmative, the navigations officer replied. He felt the UFS Intrepid turn starboard as he grasped the sides of the captain's chair. Give me a damage report, Mendez asked. A beam hit us, the sensor officer reported. Minor damage. They're firing again. Hit them with our slugs, Mendez barked. The missile they had fired hadn't chased away the Rukpli vessel. Instead, it had kept firing at them. Had the Rukpli discovered a new way to evade their missiles? Mendez hoped not. Are we able to send a comms message to the captain? Mendez asked. Negative, sir, the comms officer replied. We're being jammed. Mendez gritted his teeth. The Rukpli vessel had been waiting for them. Then another shudder swept the vessel. "Shields down to 80%, the sensor officer announced. "Get us out of weapons range now," Mendes ordered. "The Rukpli vessel is moving in faster than expected," the navigation officer said. "How come our missiles didn't take them down?" Mendes inquired. "Unable to know," the tactical officer said. Mendes slammed his fist on the console. "Find out now. If the missiles were failing to take down the smaller Rukpli vessel, they didn't have much else they could use against the Rukpli. It was possible that the Rukpli had found a way to counter their missiles." "They are firing again," the sensor officer shouted. A third shudder rolled through the bridge, and the lights blacked out. Emergency auxiliary lights flooded the bridge. "What's going on now?" Mendes hollered. "Sir, we lost power to the engines," the navigation officer reported. "I cannot move the vessel." The sensor officer turned to Mendes. "Shields are also down." Chapter 51, Unknown Planet, Vonia System. As they neared the dome-shaped building, Stanley kept glancing around. The center area was deserted. It was eerie, but he noticed boot prints on the ground. They appeared to be a few days old. This city had inhabitants, but where were they? Once they reached the front doors of the dome-shaped building, Dalton stopped and turned to him. Stanley gestured to everyone to take their positions. Dalton pushed against the doors, which opened inwards to reveal a large circular space. Stanley followed his crew inside. The top of the space had a dome-shaped ceiling. The space was like a large foyer. There were two staircases on either side. One led down to the next level, while the other led to the upper level. There was a circular balcony that encircled the entire space, a few meters above their heads. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed throughout the dome. Stanley and his crew spun around with their weapons. The sound came from every direction all at once. In a matter of a few seconds, there were alien humanoid figures standing around the balcony with their weapons pointed at Stanley and his crew. Stanley eyed the alien figures. Some of them were taller while some were shorter. All of them sported a scowl on their faces. "Do not move, humans," a voice shouted from behind him. Stanley turned slowly in the direction of the voice. A burly alien figure stood with two others on either side. Their weapons were twice the size of the mag-rail assault weapon Stanley held in his hands. The end.